Duke Cassian Vale stood alone in the grand hall of Blackthorne Castle, a man who had conquered empires but lost his own home. The emerald brooch gleamed in his palm, like a verdict he couldn't appeal. Outside, London whispered his name with the kind of satisfaction reserved for watching giants fall. Power meant nothing when the woman you married walked out before dawn without looking back. Stick with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about pride, betrayal, and the brutal cost of emotional blindness. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, because this tale gets darker before it finds light. Cassian Vale learned dominance before he learned kindness. His father, the previous Duke of Blackthorne, believed affection was poison that weakened bloodlines. Control was the only language spoken in their house. By 16, Cassian could negotiate trade agreements that left seasoned diplomats speechless. By 22, he inherited an empire built on fear and precision. By 30, no one in London dared challenge him directly. Weakness, his father whispered from the grave, was the unforgivable sin. So Cassian built his life accordingly. He chose allies based on utility, not warmth. His estate ran like a military installation where servants moved in practiced silence and orders were executed without question. Blackthorne Castle perched on northern cliffs like a monument to isolation, its endless corridors lit by silver chandeliers that threw cold light across marble floors. Visitors described the place as beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The Duke himself stood 6'3" with shoulders broad enough to block doorways. His face carried the kind of harsh symmetry that made people uncomfortable during prolonged eye contact. Dark hair, darker eyes, and a jawline that seemed engineered for delivering verdicts. He dressed in blacks and grays, colors that announced authority without requiring explanation. Women approached him at balls and political functions, drawn by title and danger in ways Cassian understood but never respected. He preferred transactions to romance, clarity over sentiment. When Parliament and his advisors began pressuring him about producing an heir, he treated marriage like another negotiation requiring strategic execution. Lady Seraphina Arden entered his life through calculated introduction at a winter gala. She came from minor nobility with respectable lineage but limited wealth. Her family needed the alliance. Cassian needed a duchess who understood duty without demanding emotional complexity. Their first conversation lasted 12 minutes. She stood near the terrace doors in deep blue silk, watching the crowd with the detached focus of someone studying a chessboard. Cassian approached because she hadn't approached him first, which was unusual enough to merit investigation. "You're not dancing," he said. She turned slowly. "I'm observing. Most women here are doing both. Most women here are performing. I prefer accuracy." Cassian felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't immediately name. She wasn't flirting. She wasn't intimidated. She was simply present, meeting his gaze with calm intelligence that carried no artifice. "You're Duke Vale," she continued. "The one who destroyed the Ashford shipping merger last month. I prevented a monopoly that would have damaged northern trade routes," he corrected, by threatening to expose Lord Ashford's mistress to his wife unless he withdrew from negotiations. Cassian's expression didn't change. "You disapprove?" Seraphina shrugged slightly. "I'm observing that you value results over methods, which makes you effective. Not necessarily honorable. The honesty should have offended him. Instead, it intrigued him. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. She seemed to want neither. They married 4 months later in a ceremony that felt more like a corporate merger than a union. Seraphina signed the contracts with steady hands, her face composed as marble. She understood the terms: a duchess in title, an heir in time, respect within defined boundaries. Love was never part of the agreement. She arrived at Blackthorne on a February afternoon when snow covered the cliffs, like forgiveness the landscape didn't deserve. Cassian watched from the eastern tower as her carriage approached, a black speck against endless white. He felt nothing resembling nervousness. This was another acquisition, another piece of his empire falling into predetermined order. He was waiting in the entrance hall when she stepped inside. Seraphina's dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that combined classical beauty with something harder underneath. Her green eyes swept across the space with analytical precision, cataloging details most people missed. She noticed the servant standing too rigidly, the way silence felt enforced rather than natural, the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "Welcome to Blackthorne," Cassian said. "It's impressive," she replied, "like a mausoleum designed by someone who confused grandeur with warmth." The staff froze. No one spoke to the Duke that way. Cassian felt his jaw tighten. "You'll find the estate operates with precision. My staff understands their duties." "I'm sure they do." Seraphina removed her gloves slowly. "I assume someone will show me to my chambers." A woman materialized from the shadows near the grand staircase, moving with practiced grace that suggested years of navigating these halls. She was perhaps 40, beautiful in the way sculptures are beautiful, cold and perfectly composed. Her dress was deep burgundy, expensive but understated. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have required an hour of skilled hands. "Your Grace," the woman said, addressing Cassian with a familiarity that made Seraphina's eyes narrow slightly. "I've prepared the Duchess's apartments according to your specifications." Cassian nodded. "Lady Evelyn Harrow serves as Blackthorne's head of household. She's managed the estate since my mother's illness." Seraphina extended her hand with formal courtesy. "Lady Harrow, I look forward to working with you." Evelyn's smile was impeccable. "Of course, Your Grace, though I must warn you that Blackthorne has its own rhythms. It takes time to understand them." The words sounded helpful. The subtext was warning. "I'm a quick study," Seraphina said quietly. That first night, Cassian came to Seraphina's chambers after midnight. The room was vast and cold despite the fire burning in the ornate fireplace. She sat at the vanity in emerald silk, brushing her hair with mechanical strokes. She didn't turn when he entered. Their wedding night had been a week ago, a physical transaction completed with technical competence and zero emotional exposure. Tonight felt like a repetition of established pattern. Cassian crossed to where she sat and placed his hands on her shoulders. Through the mirror, their eyes met. He saw calculation in her gaze, the same analytical distance she'd shown at the gala. "You're thinking," he said. "Always. About what? Whether this arrangement will destroy me or teach me something useful." The honesty was brutal and precise. It reminded him why he'd chosen her. He turned her to face him, his hands firm but not rough. Seraphina stood without resistance, her expression neutral as she studied his face. Cassian pulled her against him, feeling her body yield in the mechanical way of someone completing an obligation. Afterward, she returned to the vanity and resumed brushing her hair as though nothing had occurred. Cassian stood near the window, watching snow fall across the cliffs. Something about the moment felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Not the sex itself, but the emotional void surrounding it. They were two people sharing space without sharing anything that mattered. "Are you unhappy?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Seraphina met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm realistic. You wanted a duchess who understood the terms. I'm fulfilling my role." "That's not an answer." She set down the brush with deliberate care. "Happiness isn't part of our contract, Your Grace. You purchased my family's financial security and my womb's future productivity. I accepted those terms. Asking about my emotional state now feels like renegotiating after the deal closed." The words hit him like physical blows. He'd built his life on exactly this kind of transactional clarity, yet hearing it reflected back felt like staring into a mirror that showed something uglier than he'd imagined. "I didn't purchase you," he said quietly. Seraphina smiled without warmth. "Semantics, Your Grace. You acquired me through legal means. I'm property that breathes. Let's not pretend otherwise." Cassian left without responding because any response would have required acknowledging truths he wasn't ready to face. The days that followed revealed the architecture of dysfunction hiding beneath Blackthorne's surface. Seraphina began issuing orders to staff, reasonable requests about meal times and household schedules. The orders vanished into bureaucratic void. Servants nodded politely, then did nothing. When she inquired about the delays, she received elaborate explanations about long-standing traditions and established procedures that couldn't be modified without consulting Lady Harrow first. Letters. Seraphina, sent to her family in London, arrived weeks late, their seals clearly broken and resealed. When she confronted the head butler about the postal delays, he apologized with perfect courtesy and blamed the weather, the roads, the incompetence of mail carriers. Every excuse sounded reasonable. Every excuse was a lie. Seraphina began documenting everything. She kept detailed records of orders given and ignored, letters sent and never received, conversations where staff smiled while undermining her authority. She was building a case because evidence was the only language she trusted. Meanwhile, Evelyn moved through Blackthorne like its true mistress. Servants answered her summons immediately. Household decisions flowed through her approval. She appeared at Cassian's side during estate business with disturbing frequency, offering insights about tenant disputes and supply contracts with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years, which she had. One evening, Seraphina stood in the library watching through the doorway as Cassian reviewed documents at his desk. Evelyn sat in the chair beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She leaned forward to point at something on the page, her hand resting briefly on his forearm. The gesture looked innocent. The intimacy beneath it was not. Cassian didn't pull away. He didn't seem to notice the contact at all, which somehow made it worse. Evelyn laughed softly at something he said, the kind of comfortable laugh that came from years of shared history. Seraphina felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. She'd entered this marriage with clear eyes and realistic expectations. She didn't expect love. She didn't even expect fidelity in the emotional sense. But watching another woman occupy the space beside her husband with such casual familiarity revealed something Seraphina hadn't anticipated: jealousy. Not because she loved Cassian, she barely knew him, but because Evelyn's presence reduced Seraphina to irrelevance in her own house. The title of Duchess meant nothing when everyone obeyed someone else. That night, Seraphina confronted Cassian in his study after Evelyn finally departed. "Your head of household undermines my authority," she said, without preamble. Cassian looked up from the ledgers spread across his desk. His expression showed mild irritation at the interruption. Evelyn has served this estate for nearly a decade. She understands how Blackthorne operates. I'm your wife. My orders should be obeyed without requiring her approval. Your orders, he said slowly, often contradict established procedures. Evelyn prevents chaos. Seraphina's hands clenched at her sides. She prevents me from functioning as Duchess. Every servant in this castle answers to her before they answer to me. Letters disappear. Instructions are ignored. I'm a decorative ghost in my own home. Cassian set down his pen with controlled precision. You've been here 6 weeks. Perhaps if you spent more time learning how things work, instead of demanding immediate changes, the transition would be smoother. The dismissal was casual and absolute. Seraphina felt fury rise in her throat, hot and dangerous. She'd spent 6 weeks documenting systematic sabotage, and he was treating her like a child having a tantrum about rearranged furniture. I see, she said quietly. Thank you for clarifying where your loyalty resides. She turned to leave, but Cassian's voice stopped her. Seraphina. She didn't turn around. Evelyn's family served mine for generations. When my mother fell ill, Evelyn managed everything. She kept Blackthorne running when I was in London handling Parliament. I trust her because she's earned that trust through years of competent service. And I, Seraphina said to the doorway, have earned nothing because I arrived 6 weeks ago with a legal document instead of a decade of devotion. The silence behind her was answer enough. Winter deepened. The cliffs outside Blackthorne disappeared beneath snow that never seemed to melt. Inside the castle, Seraphina began withdrawing into herself. She stopped issuing orders that would be ignored. She stopped attempting conversations with staff who answered in polite monosyllables. She spent hours in her chambers or the library, reading books that transported her somewhere beyond these cold walls. Cassian noticed her absence the way someone notices missing furniture. Present enough to register, not important enough to investigate. He was consumed with managing a trade dispute threatening northern shipping routes. Political enemies were maneuvering to strip Blackthorne's influence over port access. The situation required his complete attention. His marriage, by contrast, seemed stable enough. Seraphina wasn't causing problems. She attended necessary functions at his side, played her role with appropriate grace, and made no demands on his time or emotions. He considered this success. Evelyn, meanwhile, ensured Cassian remained dependent on her insights. She brought him morning coffee, prepared exactly how he preferred. She anticipated his needs before he articulated them. She was indispensable in ways Seraphina would never be, because Evelyn had spent years making herself irreplaceable. And she was in love with him, had been for years, though she'd hidden it beneath professional competence and appropriate distance. She'd watched Cassian inherit Blackthorne, watched him transform from an angry young man into a duke whose name carried weight in Parliament. She'd been there through his father's death, his mother's decline, every crisis and triumph that shaped him. She'd earned her place beside him through devotion and sacrifice. Then Seraphina Arden arrived with a marriage contract and legal claim to everything Eveline had built. The fury beneath Eveline's perfect composure was volcanic. She'd spent a decade becoming essential to Cassian's life, and some minor aristocrat with a pretty face and quick wit was going to inherit it all simply because she could produce heirs. The injustice was unbearable. So Eveline began her campaign with surgical precision. She planted rumors among the staff about Seraphina's instability, little comments about the Duchess's mood swings and unreasonable demands, gentle expressions of concern about whether Lady Arden was truly suited for the pressures of managing an estate like Blackthorne. Each lie was wrapped in kindness, delivered with worried frowns and lowered voices. The servants believed her because Eveline had earned their loyalty over years. Seraphina sensed the shifting atmosphere but couldn't identify its source. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Servants exchanged glances behind her back. She felt the castle turning against her but had no evidence to present, no concrete proof beyond instinct. And Cassian wouldn't believe instinct. 3 months into the marriage, Seraphina's brother visited from London. Thomas Arden was younger than his sister by 2 years, with the same dark hair and analytical eyes. He arrived on a bright afternoon when sunlight made Blackthorne almost beautiful, though the warmth was visual only. The interior remained cold as a crypt. Seraphina met him in the blue drawing room, her composure cracking the moment the door closed behind them. Thomas pulled her into an embrace that she returned with desperate intensity. "God, Sarah," he whispered, "you look like you're drowning." She pulled back, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. Always have been." Seraphina moved to the window, staring out at grounds covered in melting snow. The landscape looked wounded, patches of dead grass showing through white like bruises surfacing on skin. "This place is killing me," she said quietly. "Not physically, but everything else." Thomas joined her at the window. "Tell me." So she did. She explained the systematic undermining, the ignored orders, the letters that disappeared. She described Eveline's invisible authority and Cassian's blind loyalty to her. She confessed her own helplessness, the way evidence dissolved the moment she tried to gather it. Thomas listened with growing fury. "Leave," he said when she finished. "Pack your things tonight and come back to London." "I can't." "Why the hell not?" Seraphina's laugh was bitter. "Because I signed a contract. Because our family's financial survival depends on this marriage. Because running away proves I'm exactly as weak as Eveline wants everyone to believe. You think staying proves you're strong. Staying proves I won't be destroyed by a situation I can't control. Not yet, anyway." Thomas gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Sarah, you're the most resilient person I know. But resilience has limits. This isn't strength. It's self-destruction disguised as endurance." "Then what should I do?" she whispered. "Fight. Gather real evidence. Confront Vale directly. Force him to see what's happening. And if he still chooses her over you, then leave with your head high, knowing you did everything possible." Seraphina nodded slowly. The advice was sound. The execution would be brutal. That night, Thomas departed for London, and Seraphina began planning her investigation with the same meticulous focus she'd once applied to her family's finances. She would document everything, build an undeniable case. Present Cassian with evidence so overwhelming he'd have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. She spent the following week observing, recording, cataloging. She noted every time staff answered Eveline before answering her. She tracked letters sent and letters received, documenting the discrepancies. She recorded conversations where Eveline subtly undermined her while maintaining perfect courtesy. The evidence accumulated like stones building a wall. But evidence required a smoking gun, something undeniable that would shatter Cassian's willful blindness. Seraphina found it on a night when winter returned with vengeance. She and Cassian had maintained their physical arrangement with mechanical regularity. Twice a week, he came to her chambers after midnight. They completed the transaction efficiently. He left. She resumed whatever she'd been doing before. This particular night, Cassian fell asleep afterward, which was unusual. He typically departed immediately. But he'd spent 18 hours managing the shipping crisis, and exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. Seraphina lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing slow into sleep rhythms. She studied his face in the firelight, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the stranger occupying her bed. He looked younger in sleep, the harsh lines of his face softening into something almost vulnerable. She wondered what kind of person he might have been if his father hadn't beaten humanity out of him. Then she felt something dig into her hip beneath the sheets. Seraphina shifted carefully, not wanting to wake him. Her hand encountered something small and hard near the center of the bed, buried beneath the heavy silk coverlet. She extracted it slowly, pulling it into the dim light. An emerald brooch gleamed in her palm. The design was distinctive, a gold setting surrounding a large central emerald with smaller stones radiating outward like frozen fire. Expensive, elegant, unmistakably feminine, and definitely not hers. Seraphina's heart began hammering against her ribs. She slid from the bed silently, crossing to the fireplace where light was stronger. She examined the brooch with trembling hands, searching for any identifying marks. On the back, engraved in delicate script, E.H. Eveline Harrow. The world tilted sideways. Seraphina stood frozen, the brooch burning in her palm like evidence at a murder trial. Her mind raced through possibilities, explanations, anything that might make this mean something other than what it obviously meant. But there was no alternative interpretation. This was Eveline's jewelry hidden in Cassian's bed. Hidden in the bed Seraphina shared with her husband. The betrayal was so blatant, so arrogant, that part of Seraphina wanted to laugh at the sheer audacity. She'd suspected Eveline of administrative sabotage. She'd worried about emotional manipulation. She hadn't imagined this. Seraphina looked at Cassian sleeping in her bed, his face peaceful in the way of men unburdened by conscience. Fury rose in her chest, white-hot and demanding. She wanted to wake him, wanted to throw the brooch at his face and demand explanations he couldn't provide. But waking him meant confrontation. And confrontation required clarity she didn't possess while rage was burning holes through her composure. So Seraphina did what she always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm logic. She built a case. She wrapped the brooch in silk and placed it in the hidden compartment of her jewelry box. She returned to bed and lay beside her sleeping husband with eyes wide open, staring at shadows dancing across the ceiling. At dawn, before Cassian woke, Seraphina began packing. She moved through her chambers with quiet efficiency, selecting only what she could carry personally. Jewelry, documents, the few items that held sentimental value. She left behind the elaborate gowns and expensive accessories Cassian had provided because taking them felt like accepting payment for services rendered. She kept the emerald brooch. Evidence was everything. Cassian woke alone in Seraphina's bed, which was unusual but not alarming. He assumed she'd risen early for breakfast or correspondence. He dressed and returned to his own chambers, his mind already occupied with the day's necessary meetings. It wasn't until noon that anyone realized the Duchess of Blackthorne was gone. Her lady's maid discovered the empty chambers and nearly empty closets. Panic rippled through the staff. The head butler informed Eveline, who informed Cassian with an expression of carefully crafted concern. Cassian stood in Seraphina's dressing room, staring at the abandoned space with confusion that slowly transformed into cold fury. She left, Eveline said quietly from the doorway. Perhaps the pressures of Blackthorne became too much. Cassian turned slowly. Did she leave a note? No, Your Grace. Though I did warn you months ago that Lady Arden seemed fragile. Not everyone is suited for this life. The comment should have irritated him. Instead, it triggered something deeper, a recognition he'd been avoiding for months. Get out, he said quietly. Eveline blinked. Your Grace. Get out. She withdrew quickly, and Cassian was alone in his wife's abandoned chambers, surrounded by evidence of her sudden departure and his own catastrophic blindness. Seraphina arrived in London before sunset, taking rooms at a discreet hotel in Belgravia. Her brother appeared within an hour of her message, his face tight with barely controlled rage. Did he hurt you? Thomas demanded the moment the door closed. Seraphina removed her gloves slowly, her hands steady despite everything. Not physically. Then what? She pulled the emerald brooch from her bag and placed it on the table between them. I found this in my bed last night. Well, technically in Cassian's bed while he slept beside me. Thomas picked up the jewelry, examining the engraving. His jaw clenched. That son of a bitch. I don't know if he placed it there or if she did, Seraphina said. But either way, the message is clear. I'm irrelevant in my own marriage. What are you going to do? Seraphina sank into the chair near the window, exhaustion finally overwhelming her careful composure. I don't know. Part of me wants to burn Blackthorne to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. Part of me wants to disappear and never speak his name again. And the rest of you. She touched the brooch with one finger, watching firelight catch in the emerald's depths. The rest of me wants to know the truth. Not speculation, not assumption. The actual truth about what's happening between my husband and his head of household. That's dangerous, Sarah. The truth might destroy you. Seraphina's smile was razor sharp. Thomas, I'm already destroyed. Finding out why might be the only thing that puts me back together. Back at Blackthorne, Cassian paced his study like a caged predator, fury and confusion warring in his chest. His duchess had vanished without explanation, abandoning 3 months of marriage and her duties to the estate. The rejection was incomprehensible. He'd provided everything she could possibly need: security, status, material comfort. He'd fulfilled every obligation outlined in their marriage contract. What more could she possibly want? Eveline knocked softly before entering, carrying tea he hadn't requested. She set the tray on his desk with practiced efficiency. Perhaps it's for the best, she said gently. A woman who abandons her responsibilities so easily was never suited to be your duchess. Cassian's hand slammed down on the desk hard enough to make the tea service jump. Do not speak about my wife that way. Eveline's eyes widened with manufactured surprise. I apologize, Your Grace. I only meant... I know what you meant, and you're wrong. He moved to the window, staring out at cliffs disappearing into twilight. Something about this entire situation felt wrong in ways that went beyond Seraphina's departure. Her leaving made no logical sense. She was intelligent, pragmatic, committed to honoring agreements even when they cost her emotionally, unless something drove her away. Something he'd failed to see. The thought opened a crack in his certainty, and through that crack poured 3 months of ignored observations. Seraphina's increasing withdrawal, her stopped attempts at managing the household. The way she'd looked at him that night in his study, fury and resignation mixing in her eyes before she'd walked away. I'm a decorative ghost in my own home. He'd dismissed her complaint as petulant adjustment to new circumstances. What if he'd been wrong? Your Grace, Eveline said carefully. Perhaps you should let her go. Some women simply cannot handle the responsibilities of nobility. Cassian turned to face his head of household, really looking at her for the first time in months. She stood with perfect posture, her expression arranged in lines of gentle concern. Everything about her screamed competence and loyalty. So why did looking at her suddenly make his skin crawl? Leave, he said quietly. But Your Grace, leave, now. Eveline departed with wounded grace, and Cassian was alone with thoughts that felt like accusations. He'd built his entire life on control and precision. He'd never failed at anything he'd committed to achieving. But standing in his study while his wife hid somewhere in London, he faced a possibility that terrified him more than any political enemy. He'd failed at his own marriage through sheer emotional negligence. And the ruthless Duke of Blackthorne, who'd never apologized for anything in his adult life, had absolutely no idea how to fix what he'd broken. The morning after Seraphina's departure, Cassian stood in the abandoned Duchess chambers like a man surveying battlefield wreckage he'd caused but couldn't comprehend. Sunlight cut through the tall windows and surgical lines, illuminating empty closet doors and the vanity stripped of her brushes and perfumes. The room still carried her scent, faint lavender mixed with something sharper he'd never identified. Now he'd never get the chance. His hands were shaking. The Duke of Blackthorne, who'd negotiated million-pound contracts without tremor, couldn't control his own fingers. A knock interrupted the silence. His secretary entered with the kind of hesitant energy people use around explosives. Your Grace, the Morning Post. Cassian didn't turn from the window. Anything urgent. Several letters from Parliament regarding the shipping dispute. Lord Ashford is demanding a meeting, and this arrived by private courier. The secretary placed a cream envelope on the vanity. The wax seal bore Seraphina's family crest. Cassian crossed the room and broke the seal with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from intention. The letter was brief. Your Grace, I require time to consider the circumstances of our arrangement. I will remain in London for the foreseeable future. Please do not attempt contact until I send word. Regards, Seraphina Arden. Not Seraphina Vale. She'd signed her maiden name like erasing their marriage with ink. Cassian read the letter 3 times, searching for subtext he knew existed but couldn't decode. The language was formal to the point of hostility. Circumstances of our arrangement. Not our marriage, not our relationship. An arrangement like she was reviewing terms of a failed business contract. What circumstances? What had he missed? The question haunted him through a day of meetings he couldn't focus on. His advisors noticed his distraction, but were smart enough not to comment. Only Lord Ashford, always willing to exploit weakness, made a veiled reference to trouble in the Vale household during negotiations. Cassian nearly broke the man's jaw before his chief advisor intervened. By evening, the Duke's legendary control was fracturing. He dismissed his staff early and locked himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey. He proceeded to attack with methodical violence. Alcohol didn't ease the confusion. It sharpened it into something closer to panic. His wife had fled. He didn't understand why, and the not knowing was destroying him in ways actual enemies never had. He was 3 drinks in when Eveline entered without knocking, carrying a dinner tray he hadn't requested and wouldn't eat. "You should rest, Your Grace. You look exhausted." Cassian stared at her through the amber lens of his glass. "Why did she leave?" Eveline set the tray down with careful precision. "I couldn't say. Perhaps the isolation became too much. Blackthorne can be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to—" "She left me a letter," he interrupted. "Called our marriage an arrangement, like I was a contract she regretted signing." Eveline's expression shifted into practiced sympathy. "Some women aren't suited for the demands placed upon a duchess. It's no reflection on you, isn't it?" "Of course not. You provided everything a wife could want, except apparently whatever she actually needed." The words surprised him as much as they surprised Eveline. He'd never spoken that way before, never questioned whether providing material comfort equaled fulfilling obligation. The crack in his certainty was widening into something that felt like a chasm. Eveline moved closer, her voice dropping into intimate registers. "You did nothing wrong, Cassian. You're a good man who married a woman incapable of appreciating what you offered." The use of his first name should have felt natural. They'd known each other for years, but something about the familiarity now made his skin crawl with wrongness he couldn't identify. "Get out," he said quietly. Eveline froze. "I'm sorry." "Leave. I need to be alone. But, Your Grace." His hand slammed the glass down hard enough to crack it. "I said, get out." She withdrew with wounded grace that would have moved him yesterday. Tonight it registered as performance. Alone again, Cassian poured another drink and forced himself to think past the anger and confusion. Seraphina was intelligent, pragmatic, not given to dramatic gestures without cause. Her departure was a message. Circumstances of our arrangement was code for something specific. What had changed between their wedding and her flight? He mentally retraced 3 months of marriage, searching for the moment everything broke. Their relationship had been functional, if emotionally sterile. She'd never complained, never demanded attention or affection beyond what their agreement required, except that one night in his study. Your orders often contradict established procedures. Eveline prevents chaos. I'm a decorative ghost in my own home. He'd dismissed her complaint as adjustment difficulties. But what if she'd been telling him something critical and he'd been too blind to see it? Cassian stood abruptly, alcohol sloshing forgotten in his glass. He left his study and walked through Blackthorne's corridors with new eyes, noticing things that had been invisible through familiarity. Every room bore Eveline's touch. Flower arrangements she'd ordered. Furniture positioned according to her preferences. Even the staff schedules reflected her authority more than his. The estate ran efficiently because Eveline controlled it, and he'd never questioned whether that control extended into territories it shouldn't reach. He found the head butler in the servants' hall, reviewing next week's menu. "Tell me honestly," Cassian said without preamble. "Did the Duchess give orders that weren't followed?" The butler's face went carefully blank. "Your Grace, I'm not sure what—" "Answer the question." A pause that lasted too long. "Lady Harrow mentioned that some of her Grace's requests conflicted with established household management. We deferred to Lady Harrow's judgment as she's overseen Blackthorne for many years." Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. "Which requests?" The butler swallowed. "Menu changes. Correspondence schedules. Staff reassignments." "Nothing critical, Your Grace. Lady Harrow assured us she would discuss the matters with the Duchess directly. Did she?" The butler's silence was answer enough. Cassian dismissed him and stood alone in the corridor, piecing together a picture that made him sick. Seraphina had tried to function as Duchess. Her authority had been systematically undermined, and he'd allowed it because confronting the problem would have required uncomfortable conversations he'd avoided. He'd chosen comfort over his wife's dignity. The realization was brutal. He spent the next 2 days conducting what amounted to an internal investigation. He interviewed staff, reviewed correspondence logs, examined household records with the same forensic attention he applied to political contracts. The evidence accumulated like stones building a wall he could no longer ignore. Seraphina's letters to her family had been delayed by days, sometimes weeks. Her household orders had been countermanded or ignored. Servants had been explicitly instructed to defer to Lady Harrow on all matters, effectively rendering the Duchess powerless. And the architect of this systematic sabotage was the woman he had trusted to manage his household. Evelyn. The name tasted like poison now. Cassian confronted her in the estate office where she worked on account books. She looked up with her usual composed smile, which died when she saw his expression. "Every letter my wife sent to London was delayed," he said quietly. "Why?" Evelyn set down her pen with careful control. "The postal schedules have been irregular due to weather. Don't lie to me." "Your Grace, I don't understand this hostility." Cassian placed the correspondence log on her desk, his finger pointing to entries highlighted in red. "These are letters Seraphina sent to her brother. According to your own records, they sat in the outgoing post room for 5 to 7 days before being sent. The weather has nothing to do with it." Evelyn's composure flickered. Perhaps there were administrative oversights. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. "Her household orders were countermanded. Staff were told to defer to you instead of their Duchess. She was systematically stripped of authority in her own home." "I was preventing chaos," Evelyn said, her voice rising slightly. Lady Arden had no experience managing an estate of this size. Her orders would have disrupted years of established procedures. "She's my wife. Her orders outrank yours." "In title, perhaps, but titles don't guarantee competence." The contempt in her voice was finally naked, stripped of professional courtesy. Cassian stared at the woman he'd trusted for nearly a decade and saw a stranger wearing her face. "You wanted her to fail," he said slowly. Evelyn stood abruptly. "I wanted to protect what we built. You and I, Cassian, we turned Blackthorne into something magnificent. Then you brought in a girl with no understanding of what we'd created and expected her to—" "We," he interrupted. "There is no we. Your staff, I'm the Duke. Any delusion beyond that exists only in your head." The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. Color drained from her face. "I've given you 10 years. I managed this estate when your mother couldn't. I stood beside you through every crisis. As my employee. As someone who loves you." The confession hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Cassian felt the world tilt sideways. Love. She thought sabotaging his marriage was an act of love. The logic was so twisted it defied comprehension. "You destroyed my wife's ability to function as Duchess because you were in love with me." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "You married the wrong woman. Someone who doesn't understand you. Who can't appreciate what you've built. I would have—" "You would have what?" Cassian's voice was dangerously quiet. "Replaced her. Somehow convinced me to set aside my legal wife and marry my head of household instead. I would have made you happy. You made me blind. There's a difference." Evelyn reached for him, her hand trembling. "Cassian, please." He stepped back like she was contagious. "Pack your things. You're dismissed effective immediately. You can't be serious. I'm giving you until tomorrow morning. Leave quietly, and I'll provide a reference that allows you to find other employment. Stay longer, and I'll ensure you never work in a noble household again." Evelyn's composure shattered completely. Tears spilled down her face, but her expression twisted into something ugly beneath the grief. "She gave you nothing," she hissed. "No warmth, no understanding. She's ice in human form, and you'll realize that when she's bled you dry of everything you are. Get out of my sight!" Evelyn fled, and Cassian stood alone in the estate office, surrounded by evidence of his catastrophic failure. He'd allowed his employee to wage war against his wife while he remained oblivious. His legendary control, his famed attention to detail, had meant nothing when it mattered most. He'd failed Seraphina in every way that counted. The realization demanded action. Cassian ordered his fastest horse prepared and rode for London before dawn, driving the animal harder than was safe, because sitting still felt like surrender. The landscape blurred past in shades of gray and brown, winter refusing to release its grip on the countryside. He reached London by late afternoon, his body exhausted but his mind sharp with desperate focus. He went directly to Seraphina's family townhouse, where her brother answered the door with an expression of pure loathing. "You have 30 seconds before I break your jaw," Thomas Arden said flatly. "I need to see my wife." She doesn't want to see you. I know what Evelyn did. I know everything, and I need Seraphina to hear that from me directly. Thomas studied him with the kind of assessment usually reserved for examining diseased livestock. You have no idea what you put her through. You're right, which is why I need to apologize. Apologizing doesn't fix systematic humiliation. Nothing fixes it, Cassian said quietly. But continuing to avoid the conversation guarantees she'll never hear the truth. Thomas's jaw worked like he was chewing broken glass. She's not here. Where is she? Why would I tell you? Cassian met the younger man's furious gaze with something that felt uncomfortably close to pleading. Because despite everything, I'm still her husband, and I'm asking you to give me a chance to make this right. You don't deserve chances. Probably not. Tell me anyway. Thomas was silent for several seconds. Then, with visible reluctance, she's staying at the Langham Hotel, room 412. If you make this worse, I'll kill you myself. Cassian believed him. 20 minutes later, the Duke of Blackthorne stood outside his wife's hotel room, his hand raised to knock and his heart hammering with something that might have been fear. He'd negotiated with hostile foreign ministers and faced down political enemies without hesitation. But confronting his own wife terrified him in ways combat never had. He knocked. Silence. Then footsteps approaching with deliberate slowness. The door opened 4 inches, held by a security chain. Seraphina's face appeared in the gap, her expression completely neutral. She looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing features that seemed sharper than he remembered. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. I need to talk to you. We have nothing to discuss. We have everything to discuss. Please, Seraphina. The use of her first name made something flicker in her eyes. She studied him through the gap with the same analytical focus she'd shown at their first meeting. Then, slowly, she closed the door. Cassian heard the chain sliding free before the door reopened fully. She stepped back, allowing him entry. The room was modest by noble standards, comfortable but impersonal. Her belongings were unpacked, suggesting she'd planned to stay a while. Seraphina crossed to the window, putting distance between them. She wore a simple gray dress, no jewelry except her wedding ring, which surprised him until he realized she probably wore it from habit rather than sentiment. 5 minutes, she said without turning. Then I want you to leave. Cassian removed his riding gloves slowly, buying time to organize thoughts that felt scattered. I fired Evelyn. That made her turn. What? She's been sabotaging you since our wedding, delaying your correspondence, countermanding your household orders, turning the staff against you. I uncovered everything 2 days ago and dismissed her immediately. Seraphina's expression didn't change. Congratulations. You discovered what I told you 3 months ago. The words hit like a blade between ribs. You're right. You told me and I didn't listen. You didn't want to listen. There's a difference. Cassian moved closer, stopping when he saw her body tense. I was wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. I allowed my employee to wage war against my wife because acknowledging the problem would have been uncomfortable. Why are you here, Cassian? Did you ride all this way to catalog your failures? I came to apologize. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. An apology? How generous. Does it come with an explanation for why Evelyn's jewelry was hidden in our bed? The question punched the air from his lungs. What? Seraphina reached into a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in silk. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing an emerald brooch that caught the lamplight like green fire. I found this, she said quietly, beneath the sheets the last night we spent together, right where your body had been lying. Her initials are engraved on the back. Cassian stared at the jewelry like it was a weapon he didn't recognize. I've never seen that before in my life. Convenient. It's the truth. I have no idea how it got there. Then who put it there, Cassian? The ghost of Christmas past. Evelyn, he said slowly. It had to be Evelyn. She must have planted it. Of course she did. Because the alternative is that you've been sleeping with your head of household while maintaining your legal wife as decorative breeding stock. The accusation was so viciously accurate in how it reflected his worst behaviors that Cassian couldn't immediately defend himself. He hadn't slept with Evelyn, but he'd emotionally relied on her in ways that excluded Seraphina. He'd valued Evelyn's opinions and comfort while dismissing his wife's legitimate complaints. The distinction between physical and emotional adultery suddenly seemed meaningless. I never touched Evelyn, he said quietly. Not once. But I failed you in every other way that matters. I isolated you, ignored your authority, allowed another woman to run my household while you stood there invisible. The brooch is a lie, but everything it represents is true. Seraphina set the jewelry down with careful precision. Why? Why what? Why marry me at all? You clearly didn't want a wife. You wanted a womb with legal documentation. Why bother with the pretense of partnership? Cassian felt something crack inside his chest, a foundation he'd built his entire life on suddenly revealing fatal flaws. Because I don't know how to be a partner. I only know how to be a duke. And dukes don't share power. They delegate it. I'm not a business holding. I know that now. Do you? Because I think you know it intellectually while still believing emotionally that everything in your life exists to serve your goals, including me. The accusation was too accurate to deny. Cassian crossed to the window where she stood, stopping close enough that he could see individual strands of hair escaping her severe style. She didn't move away, but her body remained rigid, prepared for attack or retreat. You're right, he said quietly. I treated our marriage like a contract requiring technical compliance. I provided material comfort and expected gratitude. I never asked what you actually needed because your needs weren't part of my calculations. And now I'm standing in a hotel room begging my wife to come home while having no idea how to fix what I've broken. Seraphina's eyes searched his face with painful intensity. Do you even want to fix it? Or do you just want to stop feeling like you failed at something? The question struck bone. Cassian forced himself to sit with it instead of deflecting. Why did he want Seraphina to return? Wounded pride, bruised ego, genuine remorse, the inability to accept defeat, or something else entirely. He thought about the emptiness of Blackthorne without her, the way her absence had revealed how thoroughly she'd occupied spaces he hadn't noticed her filling, her quiet presence at breakfast, the sound of her reading in the library, the weight of her body beside him in darkness. Small moments he'd dismissed as routine now felt irreplaceable. I don't know, he admitted. I can't separate wanting you back from needing to not feel like a failure. But I know that losing you revealed something I'd been avoiding. What? That dominance without emotional courage is just tyranny wearing expensive clothes. Seraphina was silent for a long moment. Then, you spent 30 years building armor against weakness. You're not going to dismantle that in 3 days of guilt. Probably not. But I can try. Why should I give you that chance? Because the alternative is walking away and spending the rest of our lives wondering what we might have built if we'd been brave enough to try. Seraphina turned fully to face him, and Cassian saw tears tracking slowly down her face. She wasn't sobbing, just crying with the quiet resignation of someone who'd held grief too long, and finally couldn't contain it anymore. I was so lonely, she whispered. In a house full of people, surrounded by luxury and status, I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. And you never noticed. Or if you did, you didn't care enough to investigate. The words destroyed him more effectively than any political attack ever had. Cassian raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement clearly, and touched her face with gentleness he didn't know he possessed. She didn't pull away. I noticed, he said quietly. I saw you withdrawing, and I convinced myself it was normal adjustment instead of a woman drowning in isolation. Because acknowledging your pain would have required me to examine my own failures, and I was too much of a coward to do that. Seraphina closed her eyes, more tears escaping. What do you want from me, Cassian? I want you to come home. I want a chance to prove I can be something other than the emotional wasteland you married. I want to try building the partnership I should have offered from the beginning. And if you can't, if you're too broken to change, then you leave with my blessing, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I destroyed the one thing that might have saved me from becoming my father. The comparison shocked her eyes open. Cassian never spoke about his father. The old duke was a ghost haunting Blackthorne's halls, present only through the damage he'd inflicted on his son. You're terrified of becoming him, Seraphina said slowly. Every single day. Then why act exactly like he did? Because I don't know any other way to be. He raised me to believe affection was weakness. That emotional exposure invited destruction. I spent 30 years building defenses so strong nothing could hurt me. Then you showed up and somehow slipped past every wall I'd constructed. And instead of being grateful, I panicked and tried to contain you. Seraphina reached up and covered his hand with hers, the contact almost unbearably intimate. I can't fix you, Cassian. I can barely keep myself functional most days. I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to be patient while I figure out how to fix myself. Patience requires trust, and you've given me every reason to trust nothing about you. I know, so what do we do? Cassian had no answer. He stood in a hotel room with his wife, both of them damaged and exhausted and completely out of strategies. The silence stretched between them, full of everything neither could articulate. Then Seraphina spoke, her voice barely above whisper. Show me something real. Not the Duke, not the political strategist, just you. The person you'd be if you weren't terrified of being human. Cassian felt something inside him crack open, spilling emotions he'd spent decades containing. Fear, grief, loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. The weight of becoming exactly what he'd sworn he'd never be. And beneath it all, the desperate need to matter to someone for reasons beyond utility. I'm terrified, he said quietly. I have no idea how to be vulnerable without it feeling like dying. Every instinct I have screams that lowering my guard invites destruction. But standing here without you feels worse than any destruction I can imagine. Seraphina's fingers tightened around his. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. It's the most honest thing I've said to anyone. She pulled his hand down but didn't release it. I need time, Cassian. I need to know you're committed to actual change and not just performing remorse until I agree to come home. What do you need from me? Space. And proof that you understand why I left. He wanted to argue, wanted to demand she return to Blackthorne immediately so he could demonstrate his commitment. But forcing compliance was exactly the behavior that had destroyed their marriage. So instead he nodded. How long? As long as it takes. Cassian felt his heart trying to break free from his chest. The idea of returning to Blackthorne without her was unbearable. But bearing it was apparently the price of earning her trust back. I'll wait, he said, and you'll actually work on yourself. Not just avoid Evelyn and assume that fixes everything. I'll work on myself. Seraphina studied him with eyes that saw too much. Then prove it. Go back to Blackthorne. Figure out who you are when you're not hiding behind power. And when you've made actual progress, send for me. Cassian pulled her against him before thought could stop action. She stiffened, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent he'd thought he'd lost forever. I will earn you back, he whispered against her temple, even if it takes the rest of my life. She didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. They stood like that for several minutes, two damaged people holding each other in the ruins of what they'd almost built. Then Seraphina stepped back, wiping her face with shaking hands. You should go. Cassian wanted to refuse, wanted to stay until she agreed to return with him, but that was control masquerading as love, and he was trying to be better than his worst instincts. So he left. The ride back to Blackthorne took 6 hours through darkness and gathering cold. Cassian pushed his horse hard, trying to outrun thoughts that chased him like wolves. By the time he reached the estate, exhaustion had reduced him to something raw and undefined. He dismissed his staff and locked himself in his study with orders not to be disturbed. Then he sat in darkness and forced himself to examine every decision that had led to his wife fleeing in the night. The inventory was brutal. He'd married Seraphina for strategic reasons, while convincing himself duty was sufficient foundation for partnership. He'd ignored her isolation because acknowledging it required emotional energy he didn't want to expend. He'd allowed Evelyn to undermine Seraphina's authority because confronting the situation meant uncomfortable conversations about boundaries and loyalty. He'd been a coward hiding behind the appearance of strength, and now his wife was in London, and he was alone in a castle that felt like a tomb, and he had no idea how to become the person she deserved. But he was going to try. Over the following weeks, Cassian began the painful work of dismantling defenses he'd spent a lifetime building. He met with the estate staff and explicitly outlined new protocols that centered the Duchess's authority. He reviewed every household procedure and eliminated traditions that existed only because they'd always existed. He wrote to political allies and began extracting himself from commitments that required his constant presence in London. He was rebuilding Blackthorne into a place Seraphina might actually want to inhabit. But the harder work was internal. Cassian started keeping a journal, forcing himself to examine thoughts and feelings he'd always dismissed as weakness. He wrote about his father's brutality, his mother's slow dissolution into madness, the way he'd learned to equate emotional exposure with danger. The armor he'd constructed to survive childhood had become the prison destroying his marriage. The revelations were agonizing. He hired a former military physician who specialized in what he called disorders of the mind, men whose battlefield trauma had broken something essential inside them. The physician listened to Cassian's history with calm professionalism, then delivered an assessment that felt like judgment. You learn to survive by becoming unreachable. Now you're discovering that survival and living are different things. How do I change? The same way you'd rebuild anything, carefully, with patience you don't naturally possess, and with the understanding that progress isn't linear. So Cassian worked. He forced himself to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of deflecting. He practiced admitting uncertainty. He wrote letters to Seraphina that he never sent, confessing fears and hopes he'd never articulated to another human being. The process felt like dying by degrees, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began shifting. The constant tension in his shoulders eased. His sleep improved. He started noticing details about the estate he'd been blind to for years. The way morning light hit the library windows, the sound of wind across the cliffs. Small moments of beauty his armor had filtered out as irrelevant. 6 weeks after Seraphina's departure, Cassian received a letter bearing her seal. He opened it with hands that trembled despite years of practiced control. The message was brief. I hear you've made changes at Blackthorne. My brother visited and confirmed you dismissed Evelyn and restructured the household. I'm not ready to return yet, but I'm willing to meet you in London to discuss what comes next. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door left slightly open. And for a man who'd nearly destroyed everything through emotional negligence, that door represented the only thing worth fighting for. Cassian wrote back immediately, agreeing to meet wherever and whenever she wished. Then he sat in his study and allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in decades. Hope that felt too fragile to survive but too essential to abandon. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Location: a private tea room in Mayfair. Time: 3 in the afternoon. Cassian arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time trying to control his breathing like a soldier preparing for combat. When Seraphina entered, the world contracted to just her face. She looked better than she had at the hotel, less exhausted, more present. She wore deep green that made her eyes luminous, her hair arranged simply but elegantly. She moved with the same composed grace he remembered, but something beneath it had changed. She looked like someone who'd survived something terrible and emerged harder for it. They sat across from each other at a small table near the back. Tea was brought. Neither touched it. You look different, Seraphina said finally. Cassian managed a slight smile. Evelyn's departure freed up considerable mental energy. She didn't smile back. Thomas says you've restructured the entire household management. I eliminated every tradition that existed only because no one questioned it. The staff now answer to whoever becomes Duchess. The position has actual authority instead of decorative status. And if I never return, then the next Duchess will still benefit from changes you should have had from the beginning. Seraphina's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. Why now, Cassian? Why wait until I left to implement changes I begged for while I was there? Because I'm a coward who only confronts problems when ignoring them becomes impossible. The honesty seemed to surprise her. That's not what dukes usually admit. Dukes are usually emotional cripples hiding behind titles. I'm trying not to be. How's that working out? It's the hardest thing I've ever done, which probably means it's necessary. Seraphina finally met his eyes directly. I can't come back to how things were. I know. And I won't be the decorative wife who produces heirs while you conduct the actual business of living. I know that too. So what are you offering? Cassian leaned forward, choosing words with the precision usually reserved for political negotiations. Partnership. Actual, functional partnership where your voice carries equal weight to mine. A marriage that's more than strategic alliance. A chance to build something neither of us has any idea how to build, but might be worth the risk anyway. And if we fail, then we fail having actually tried instead of pretending duty was sufficient. Seraphina was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would define the rest of her life. I'll come back to Blackthorne, but on one condition. Anything. We start over. Completely over. Not as Duke and Duchess fulfilling obligations. As two people trying to figure out if they can actually build something real together. Cassian felt hope and terror colliding in his chest. I can do that. Can you, though? Because starting over means dismantling every defense mechanism you've spent 30 years perfecting. It means being vulnerable in ways that will feel like bleeding. It means trusting me with parts of yourself you've shown no one. I know. And you're willing to risk that. Cassian reached across the table and took her hand in his. The contact felt electric, dangerous in all the ways emotional exposure always had. But he held on anyway. I'm willing to risk everything, he said quietly, if it means becoming someone worth being married to. Seraphina's fingers tightened around his. And the Duke of Blackthorne, who'd never gambled on anything he couldn't control, prepared to bet everything on the possibility that love might be something you build instead of something you're born knowing, even if the construction destroyed him in the process. Seraphina returned to Blackthorne on a morning when spring was attempting to break winter's grip on the northern cliffs. The landscape looked wounded, snow retreating to reveal dead grass and exposed stone. She arrived in the same carriage that had brought her months ago, but this time Cassian stood waiting at the entrance himself instead of sending staff. He looked different, thinner, harder in some ways, softer in others. The arrogant certainty that had defined him seemed diminished, replaced by something more cautious. He watched her descend from the carriage with the focused attention of someone who understood he was being evaluated and the results mattered. "Welcome home," he said quietly. Seraphina studied the castle rising behind him, like a monument to everything that had gone wrong between them. Home felt like the wrong word. Blackthorne was a battlefield where they'd try to build something that might resemble a marriage. Whether it became home depended on what happened next. "Show me what you've changed," she said instead of responding to his greeting. So he did. They walked through Blackthorne together while Cassian outlined the restructured household management. New staff hierarchies, revised communication protocols. Every tradition that had undermined her authority had been eliminated or modified. He'd kept detailed records of every change, presenting them like evidence in a trial where he was both defendant and prosecutor. Seraphina listened without commenting. The changes were real and substantial. But changes to furniture arrangements and staff schedules meant nothing if the emotional architecture between them remained broken. After the tour, they stood in the library where afternoon light cut through tall windows and golden blades. Dust moved through the beams like microscopic stars. The room smelled of leather and old paper and the specific kind of silence libraries generated. "These are good changes," Seraphina said finally. "But they're external. What have you changed internally?" Cassian moved to the window, his back to her. The question demanded vulnerability he still wasn't comfortable displaying, but discomfort was apparently the price of reconstruction. "I've been working with a physician who specializes in trauma," he said quietly. "Military men whose battlefield experiences broke something essential. He's helping me understand how survival mechanisms become prisons. And what have you learned? That I built armor so effective I couldn't remove it even when it was killing everything I touched. That dominance without emotional courage is just fear wearing expensive clothes. That I became exactly what I swore I'd never be because I was too terrified to examine who I actually was underneath the performance." Seraphina crossed to stand beside him at the window. Their reflections merged in the glass, two figures overlapping without quite touching. "That's the most introspective thing I've ever heard you say. Introspection is brutal when you've spent 30 years avoiding it." She turned to face him directly. "I need to know this isn't performance. That you're not just saying what you think I want to hear until I settle back into being the decorative duchess. How do I prove it's real? Time. Consistency. Actually living differently instead of just talking about it." Cassian finally met her eyes. "Then we'll take time. As much as you need." They established new rhythms slowly, carefully, like people relearning how to walk after injury. Breakfast together in the smaller dining room instead of eating separately. Evening walks along the cliffs when weather permitted. Conversations that went beyond logistics and touched on actual thoughts and feelings. It was awkward. Neither of them knew how to be emotionally available without feeling exposed. But they tried. Cassian found himself talking about his childhood in ways he never had before. The terror of his father's rages, his mother's slow descent into madness, while everyone pretended nothing was wrong. The way he'd learned to survive by becoming unreachable. Seraphina shared her own history, the financial collapse that had destroyed her family's stability, her father's drinking, the weight of being responsible for everyone's survival before she was old enough to understand what that meant, the betrayal by an uncle who'd stolen what little remained of their fortune. They were both damaged in complementary ways, carrying scars that made connection feel dangerous. But connection was what they were attempting to build anyway. 3 weeks after Seraphina's return, Cassian woke in darkness to find her side of the bed empty. Panic gripped him immediately, the visceral terror of discovering she'd fled again. He pulled on clothes and went searching through the castle's dim corridors. He found her in the library, sitting in the window seat with her knees drawn up, staring out at moonlight on the cliffs. She wore a silk robe over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked impossibly young and impossibly sad. Cassian approached slowly, telegraphing his presence. "Can't sleep." Seraphina didn't turn from the window. "Sometimes I wake up convinced this is temporary, that I'll discover you're just waiting for me to relax before reverting to who you were." The honesty was brutal. Cassian sat on the opposite end of the window seat, maintaining distance. "I'm terrified of the same thing, that I'll wake up and discover all this effort was performance, that I'm fundamentally incapable of being anything other than what my father made me." "Are you?" "I don't know yet, but I'm willing to find out." Seraphina finally looked at him. "Why? Why are you willing to do this work when walking away would be easier?" Cassian had asked himself the same question during his darkest moments. The answer still felt fragile, barely formed. "Because losing you showed me that dominance without love is just elaborate loneliness. Because I've spent 30 years being powerful and miserable, and I'm tired of confusing the two. Because you're the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth salvaging beneath the armor. And if there's nothing worth salvaging, then at least I'll know I tried." Seraphina studied him with those analytical eyes that missed nothing. Then she shifted across the window seat and leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The contact felt tentative but deliberate. Cassian wrapped his arm around her carefully, like holding something precious and breakable. They sat like that until dawn started bleeding across the horizon, two damaged people trying to build warmth from the wreckage of everything they'd destroyed. The weeks that followed felt almost normal. They developed routines, shared meals, walked the estate together, made love occasionally with a tenderness that surprised them both. It wasn't perfect. They still fought about boundaries and expectations, but the fights felt productive instead of destructive. Cassian caught himself laughing one afternoon at something Seraphina said, an actual genuine laugh that surprised him with its spontaneity. She smiled back, and the moment felt like something they'd built instead of something imposed by obligation. Progress was painful and slow and incredibly fragile, which made the betrayal, when it came, absolutely devastating. It started with letters arriving from London. Political correspondence Cassian had been expecting regarding the shipping alliance. He reviewed them in his study while Seraphina worked on estate ledgers across the room. The arrangement felt domestic, comfortable in ways Cassian hadn't experienced before. Then he opened the fourth letter and the world tilted sideways. The correspondence was from Lord Ashford, the same political rival Cassian had outmaneuvered months ago. The tone was congratulatory, almost friendly. It praised Cassian's recent restructuring of household management and commended his wisdom in finally recognizing where true loyalty resided. Cassian read it twice, confusion mounting. Then he reached the final paragraph. "Lady Harrow has been most helpful in providing insights into your changing priorities. Her observations about the Duchess's influence over your decision-making have proven invaluable to those of us concerned about Blackthorne's stability. We look forward to continuing our productive dialogue." Ice flooded Cassian's veins. He stood abruptly, the letter crumpling in his fist. Seraphina looked up from her work, concern crossing her face. "What's wrong?" Cassian couldn't speak. His mind was racing through implications that made him physically sick. Eveline hadn't disappeared after her dismissal. She'd gone to his political enemies, and she'd been feeding them information. Information about his marriage, about Seraphina's influence, about changes at Blackthorne that could be weaponized against him. The strategic brilliance was actually impressive. Eveline knew Cassian's vulnerabilities better than anyone. She understood which details would alarm his rivals most. A powerful duke distracted by domestic concerns, a wife with growing influence over estate decisions, evidence of emotional instability masquerading as reform. She'd turned his attempt at redemption into ammunition for his destruction. "Cassian," Seraphina said, standing now. "What happened?" He handed her the letter without speaking, watched her face change as she read, shock giving way to something colder. "She's been sabotaging you," Seraphina said quietly. "Still, even after being dismissed, not just sabotaging, weaponizing, she's giving my enemies exactly what they need to question my fitness for the shipping alliance. Every change I made to repair our marriage becomes evidence that I'm compromised. Seraphina set the letter down with careful control. What will they do? Move against me in Parliament, attempt to strip Blackthorne's authority over northern trade routes, paint me as unstable, ruled by emotion instead of strategy. Everything I've built politically for the last decade is suddenly vulnerable. The analysis was correct, but incomplete. The real danger was deeper. Cassian had spent weeks dismantling his armor, becoming vulnerable in ways that would have been unthinkable months ago. He'd exposed himself emotionally because that's what marriage required, and now that exposure was being used to destroy him. The bitter irony was suffocating. He'd finally learned to be human, and humanity was going to cost him everything. Over the following days, more letters arrived. Political allies expressing concern about rumors of instability at Blackthorne. Rivals circling like sharks scenting blood. Every message carried the same subtext. Duke Vale had become weak, distracted by domestic drama, unfit to maintain influence over critical trade infrastructure. Cassian watched his political coalition fracturing in real time. He called emergency meetings with his closest advisors, attempted to control the damage through strategic communications, but the rumors had taken root. Evelyn had been thorough and patient, spreading her poison over weeks through whisper networks and careful innuendo. By the time Cassian understood the scope of the attack, the damage was catastrophic. A vote was scheduled in Parliament for the following week. The motion would transfer authority over northern shipping routes from Blackthorne to a consortium of rival houses. Cassian's decades of carefully constructed influence were about to evaporate because his former head of household had turned his emotional growth into evidence of weakness. Seraphina watched him unravel with something between sympathy and horror. "This is my fault," she said one night as Cassian paced his study like a caged animal. "If I hadn't left, if I just endured—" "Don't!" he interrupted sharply. "Don't rewrite our history to absolve me. I created this disaster by being blind and arrogant. You leaving was the only sane response to my failures. But your attempts to fix things are what gave Evelyn ammunition." Cassian stopped pacing, his hands braced against the desk. The irony was vicious. He'd finally done the right thing, and it was destroying him. The universe apparently had a dark sense of humor. "What are you going to do?" Seraphina asked quietly. "I don't know." And that was the truth. Every instinct Cassian possessed screamed for him to revert to his old strategies, crush Evelyn publicly, deploy the same ruthless tactics that had built his empire, destroy his enemies before they destroyed him. But those tactics required the armor he'd spent weeks dismantling, required becoming the person he'd sworn he wouldn't be anymore. The choice was brutal in its simplicity. Remain vulnerable and lose everything, or revert to the Duke who felt nothing and dominated everyone. Humanity or power. There was no option that allowed both. 3 days before the parliamentary vote, Cassian received a visitor. Thomas Arden arrived at Blackthorne unannounced, his expression grim. Seraphina met him in the entrance hall, and they spoke in urgent whispers before she brought him to Cassian's study. "My sister tells me you're being destroyed politically," Thomas said without preamble. Cassian poured whiskey he wouldn't drink. "Your sister is correct. Evelyn Harrow is the source." "Yes." Thomas accepted the glass Cassian offered. "I may have information that helps." Cassian felt something stir in his chest, hope he didn't trust. "What kind of information?" Thomas pulled documents from his coat. "I've been investigating Lady Harrow since Seraphina first mentioned her. The woman has been systematically embezzling from Blackthorne for years. Small amounts, carefully hidden, but it accumulates to nearly £50,000. Cassian stared at the financial records Thomas spread across the desk. The evidence was meticulous. Altered account books, fictional household expenses, money diverted into accounts registered to shell entities. Evelyn controlled. "She's been stealing from you while pretending devotion," Thomas continued. "Expose this and you destroy her credibility. Your political enemies lose their primary source. The parliamentary vote swings back in your favor. It was perfect, the kind of devastating counterattack Cassian would have deployed without hesitation months ago. Evelyn had given him the weapon to annihilate her. All he had to do was use it. Cassian studied the documents, his mind running calculations with practiced efficiency. Exposing Evelyn's theft would save his political position, vindicate his changes at Blackthorne, prove to Parliament that he'd been deceived by a criminal, not weakened by marriage. He could win, but victory required becoming the man he'd been trying to stop being. Seraphina watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. She understood the choice he was facing, saw the fork in the road where every path cost something irreplaceable. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. Cassian set the documents down. "I'm thinking that using this information makes me exactly what I've spent 2 months trying not to be. A man who responds to every threat with overwhelming force, who destroys people instead of understanding them." "She stole from you," Thomas said flatly, "for years, while pretending loyalty." "I know. And she's actively trying to destroy your political influence." "I know that too. Then what's the problem? You have evidence that saves everything you've built. Use it." Cassian moved to the window overlooking cliffs where waves hammered stone with relentless violence. The problem was that using this information meant reverting to the Duke who felt nothing, who treated people as obstacles to eliminate, who confused dominance with strength. He'd spent weeks learning that real power meant accepting vulnerability, meant acknowledging that some things mattered more than winning. But did they matter more than survival? Seraphina crossed to stand beside him. "You're wondering if being good is worth losing everything." It was exactly what he was wondering. The question felt like betrayal of everything he'd worked toward. But losing his political influence meant losing Blackthorne's security, meant becoming irrelevant in the systems that had defined his entire adult life. How much was vulnerability worth when it cost you the foundation of your existence? "I don't know how to be powerless," Cassian said quietly. "I've spent my entire life building defenses against exactly that. Asking me to accept political destruction feels like asking me to stop breathing." Seraphina's hand found his. "No one's asking you to accept destruction. We're asking you to choose which kind of power you want. The kind that requires you to be inhuman, or the kind that allows you to be whole. What if being whole means being weak? What if being whole means being strong in ways that actually matter?" Cassian looked at his wife, this woman who'd survived her own betrayals and somehow maintained her humanity through all of it. She was offering him a choice he'd never imagined existed, a path that didn't require sacrificing himself on the altar of dominance. But taking that path meant accepting consequences he wasn't sure he could survive. Thomas cleared his throat. "You have 2 days before Parliament votes. Whatever you decide, decide quickly." Cassian spent those 2 days in agony. He reviewed the evidence against Evelyn repeatedly, the documents offering salvation through destruction. He drafted speeches exposing her crimes, planned the strategic deployment of information that would annihilate her credibility. The old Duke would have executed the plan without hesitation. The new person he was trying to become felt sick at the prospect. Seraphina gave him space to decide, understanding that some choices had to be made alone. But she left him with words that haunted his sleepless nights. "Power built on destroying others is just fear in expensive packaging. Real strength is choosing mercy when vengeance would be easier." The morning of the parliamentary vote arrived with cold rain hammering Blackthorne's windows. Cassian stood in his dressing room, preparing for the journey to London. The documents exposing Evelyn sat on his desk, ready to deploy. All he had to do was take them. Seraphina appeared in the doorway, already dressed for travel. She would accompany him to London, stand beside him in Parliament, face his enemies together. The sight of her strengthened something in his chest that felt dangerously close to hope. "Are you taking the evidence?" she asked quietly. Cassian looked at the documents that represented everything he'd been. The ruthless strategist who turned human weakness into ammunition. The Duke who never lost because losing wasn't an option he permitted. That person had been powerful and utterly alone. "No," he said finally. "I'm not taking them." Seraphina's eyes widened slightly. "You're going to let Evelyn win. I'm going to face Parliament without destroying someone to save myself, even if that someone deserves destruction. Cassian, you could lose everything." "I know. Then why?" "Because using those documents means proving to the world that I only changed tactics, not character. That the moment things got difficult, I reverted to being the monster I've always been. And if I do that, everything we've built means nothing." Seraphina crossed to him, her hands framing his face. "You're risking your entire political legacy. I'm choosing you over power. There's a difference." The words hung between them, fragile and enormous. Cassian had never chosen anything over power, had never imagined circumstances where such choice would even occur to him. But standing in front of his wife, facing the possibility of political annihilation, he discovered something that redefined everything he'd understood about strength. Loving someone meant prioritizing their respect over your survival. And for the first time in his life, Cassian Vale cared more about being worthy of love than being feared. They rode to London through rain that turned the road to mud, reached Parliament as afternoon light struggled through heavy clouds. The building loomed like a cathedral to ambition, its halls crowded with aristocrats who'd come to watch the Duke of Blackthorne's humiliation. Eveline was there. Cassian saw her in the gallery, dressed in elegant gray, her expression serene. She looked like a woman who'd already won, who understood that exposure of his emotional transformation had destroyed his political invincibility. Their eyes met across the crowded chamber. Hers held triumph. His held something she didn't recognize: acceptance. The session was called to order. The motion to strip Blackthorne's shipping authority was read aloud. Then Lord Ashford rose to present his case, outlining concerns about Duke Vale's recent instability and questionable judgment. The speech was brutal and effective. It painted Cassian as a man compromised by emotional entanglements, distracted from his responsibilities, unfit to maintain control over critical infrastructure. Every accusation was delivered with concerned regret that made it more damaging than open hostility. When Ashford finished, silence filled the chamber like water flooding a sinking ship. Then the speaker called for Duke Vale to respond. Cassian stood slowly, every eye in the chamber fixed on him. He could feel Seraphina's presence in the gallery, a steady anchor in the storm, could feel Eveline's anticipation of his collapse. He walked to the speaker's position without notes, without the evidence that would save him, with nothing but the truth he'd been too afraid to speak for 30 years. And the Duke of Blackthorne, who'd built an empire on control and dominance, began the most terrifying speech of his life by admitting he'd been wrong about everything. Cassian stood before Parliament with his heart hammering against his ribs, like it was trying to escape the cage of his chest. Every face in the chamber watched him with varying degrees of anticipation, contempt, or barely concealed satisfaction. These were men who'd spent years calculating his weaknesses, searching for the fault line that would bring down the northern empire he'd built through precision and fear. They thought they'd found it. They thought his marriage had made him weak, and standing there without armor or strategy or the ruthless weapons he'd always deployed, Cassian realized they might be right. But weakness and strength were concepts he was learning to redefine, and the education was going to cost him everything he'd spent 30 years accumulating. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the usual whispers and shuffling had ceased. They were waiting for him to defend himself with the calculated brutality that had made his reputation. Waiting for the Duke of Blackthorne to remind them why crossing him was political suicide. Instead, Cassian did something he'd never done in his entire political career. He told them the truth. "Lord Ashford has presented concerns about my recent behavior," Cassian began, his voice carrying through the chamber with the same authority it always had. "He's painted a picture of a man compromised by emotional entanglements, distracted from his responsibilities, unfit to maintain authority over northern shipping routes." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. This wasn't denial. It sounded almost like agreement. "He's not wrong," Cassian continued. The murmurs exploded into shocked conversation. Seraphina's hand gripped the gallery railing so hard her knuckles went white. Even Eveline looked surprised, her serene expression fracturing into confusion. Cassian waited for silence, then continued with words that felt like swallowing broken glass. "I have been compromised. Not by my wife, but by my own refusal to examine who I'd become. For 30 years, I've operated under the assumption that strength meant dominance, that effective leadership required emotional detachment, that caring about anything beyond power made you vulnerable to destruction." He paused, letting the admission settle over the chamber like ash after an explosion. "I was wrong." Someone in the back laughed, a short bark of disbelief quickly silenced. Cassian continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled lords with the same intensity he'd used to intimidate them for decades. But now the intensity carried something different underneath, something that looked disturbingly like honesty. "I built my political influence by treating human beings as obstacles or assets. I crushed opposition without considering whether opposition might contain legitimate concerns. I accumulated power while convincing myself that power and purpose were the same thing." "Where the hell is he going with this?" someone whispered loudly enough to carry. "Then I married a woman I selected for strategic reasons, and proceeded to ignore her systematic isolation because acknowledging it would have been uncomfortable. My head of household waged a campaign of sabotage against my wife for months, while I remained willfully blind because confronting the truth would have required examining my own failures. Cassian's eyes found Evelyn in the gallery. She sat frozen, her face pale as winter. When my Duchess finally fled Blackthorne in the middle of the night, I was forced to confront what I'd become. And what I discovered was a man who'd confused control with leadership, who'd built an empire on fear while convincing himself it was respect, who was on a direct path to becoming the exact tyrant I'd sworn I'd never be. The chamber had gone completely silent again. This wasn't political theater. This was confession delivered with the brutal precision of a surgeon removing infected tissue. Lord Ashford is correct that I've changed, Cassian said. I've spent the last 3 months dismantling defense mechanisms I've relied on since childhood, learning to be vulnerable instead of dominant, choosing emotional honesty over strategic manipulation. It's been the most difficult work of my life, and it's made me a better leader than I've ever been. The assertion landed like a bomb. Outrage rippled through the chamber. Someone shouted that emotional instability wasn't leadership. Another voice called him delusional. The chaos built like a wave preparing to crash. Cassian's voice cut through it with the force of absolute conviction. A leader who cannot examine his own failures becomes dangerous to everyone under his authority. A leader who confuses dominance with strength eventually destroys everything he touches. I've spent 30 years being that dangerous leader, and I'm done. He pulled papers from his coat, but not the evidence Thomas had provided. These were different documents. Cassian held them up so the chamber could see. These are proposals I've drafted for restructuring how Blackthorne manages its shipping authority. Increased transparency, oversight committees that include merchant representatives, revenue sharing with smaller ports that have been systematically excluded from negotiations. What are you doing? Lord Ashford demanded, standing abruptly. I'm proving that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness, that a leader secure enough to admit his failures is stronger than one who hides behind performance. This is madness, another lord shouted. You're surrendering power that's been yours for a decade. I'm sharing power that should never have been concentrated in one person's hands, Cassian corrected. The current system works efficiently because I've made it work through force and intimidation. But efficiency built on fear creates resentment, and resentment eventually becomes rebellion. He was saying everything his advisors had begged him never to say, admitting weaknesses his enemies could exploit, offering concessions that would diminish his authority. And he was doing it deliberately, because real strength, Cassian had finally learned, wasn't about never showing vulnerability. It was about being strong enough to be honest when dishonesty would be easier. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Lords shouted over each other. Some demanded immediate vote on the shipping authority transfer. Others called for recess to consider these unprecedented proposals. A few looked genuinely stunned, like they'd witnessed something they didn't have conceptual framework to process. Through it all, Cassian stood at the speaker's position, calm as stone, while the political world he'd built collapsed around him. Then Evelyn stood in the gallery. Her movement cut through the noise like a blade. Every eye turned toward her. She looked furious and desperate. Her perfect composure finally shattered into something raw and ugly. "This is a performance," she shouted, her voice carrying across the chamber. "Duke Vale is manipulating you with false humility. I've served his household for 10 years. I know exactly what he is. Ruthless, calculating, incapable of the emotional growth he claims." The chamber went silent again, fascinated by this unexpected intervention. Cassian turned to face her directly. "Lady Harrow, thank you for that assessment. Would you care to explain why someone who served my household so faithfully is now attempting to destroy my political standing?" Evelyn's face flushed. "I'm protecting these lords from a dangerous fiction. You haven't changed. You've just found a new strategy. By proposing reforms that reduce my own power. By manipulating everyone into believing you're some transformed soul when you're exactly what you've always been." Cassian pulled out another document. And this time Evelyn's expression shifted into something close to panic. He held it up for the chamber to see. "This is evidence of systematic embezzlement from Blackthorne's accounts over the last 6 years. Nearly £50,000 diverted through fictional household expenses and shell companies. All traced back to Lady Evelyn Harrow." The chamber exploded again. Evelyn swayed like she'd been physically struck. Lord Ashford looked between Cassian and the documents with growing alarm. There it was, the weapon that would save him. The evidence that would destroy his enemy and vindicate everything he'd claimed. All he had to do was use it the way the old Duke would have. "I obtained this evidence 3 days ago," Cassian continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. My advisors urged me to deploy it immediately, to crush Lady Harrow's credibility and prove that my political enemies are allied with a criminal. He paused, the documents still held high where everyone could see them. Then he lowered his hand. I'm not going to do that. The words fell into stunned silence. Even Seraphina looked shocked. Evelyn stared at him from the gallery, her face a mask of confusion and terror. Lady Harrow did steal from me, Cassian said quietly. She did sabotage my marriage. She is currently working with my political enemies to destroy my influence. All of that is true. Then expose her, Lord Ashford demanded. Prove your enemies are liars and criminals. Cassian looked at the documents in his hand, evidence of betrayal that could save everything he'd built. Then he looked at Seraphina in the gallery, at the woman who'd survived her own betrayals without becoming the thing that had hurt her. And he made the choice that would define who he actually was underneath 30 years of armor. No, he said simply. The chamber erupted into absolute pandemonium. Lords shouted accusations of weakness and stupidity. Ashford looked triumphant, sensing victory. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Cassian raised his voice to be heard over the chaos. I'm refusing to deploy this evidence because using it makes me exactly what I've claimed I'm not. A man who responds to every threat with overwhelming force, who destroys people instead of understanding them, who treats human weakness as ammunition. This is political suicide, someone shouted. This is choosing integrity over victory, Cassian corrected. Lady Harrow betrayed me because she believed she loved me. That doesn't excuse her actions, but it explains them. And I contributed to her delusion by allowing emotional boundaries to remain undefined for years. So you're just forgiving her, Ashford said incredulously. I'm refusing to become the monster she believes I am. There's a difference. The distinction was lost on most of the chamber. They saw a duke surrendering weapons that could save him, saw weakness disguised as principle, saw everything they'd always suspected about emotional vulnerability destroying a man's effectiveness. They saw exactly what Cassian had always believed, and he was choosing differently anyway. The speaker called for order, his voice barely audible over the continuing chaos. It took several minutes before the chamber quieted enough for proceedings to continue. Lord Ashford moved immediately to call the vote on stripping Blackthorne's shipping authority. Cassian didn't try to stop him. The vote was brutal and swift. Lords who'd allied with Blackthorne for years voted against him, unwilling to support someone who'd just demonstrated such spectacular political incompetence. Others abstained, confused by what they'd witnessed. When the count finished, the result was devastating. The motion passed. Blackthorne's authority over northern shipping routes was transferred to a consortium of rival houses effective immediately. Cassian Vale had just lost the foundation of his political power. The chamber erupted into conversation. Some lords looked satisfied. Others looked almost sympathetic. A few seemed genuinely disturbed by what they'd witnessed, like watching someone deliberately walk off a cliff. Cassian stood at the speaker's position, his face composed despite having just surrendered everything he'd spent a decade building. He looked up at the gallery, where Seraphina sat with tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met across the crowded chamber, and Cassian realized he'd never felt stronger in his entire life. Because strength, real strength, wasn't about winning every battle. It was about choosing who you wanted to be even when being that person cost you everything. The speaker dismissed the session. Lords filed out of the chamber in clusters, already plotting how to capitalize on Blackthorne's fall from power. Cassian descended from the speaker's position slowly, his body moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. He'd just destroyed his political legacy in less than an hour. Seraphina met him at the chamber entrance. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with something that looked like fierce pride. She didn't speak, just took his hand and held it with crushing intensity. They walked out of Parliament together into rain that had intensified to a downpour. The carriage waited, but neither moved toward it immediately. They stood in the rain while London moved around them, indifferent to the personal apocalypse that had just occurred. You gave up everything, Seraphina said finally, her voice barely audible over the rain. I chose you over power. That's not giving up. That's finally understanding what matters. Your political influence is destroyed. My political influence was built on being someone I hated. I'd rather have nothing and be able to look at myself in a mirror. Seraphina pulled him against her, her body shaking with sobs she'd been holding back. Cassian wrapped his arms around his wife and let the rain wash over them both. Two people who'd survived destruction by choosing each other over everything the world said mattered. They stood like that until the rain began to ease. then climbed into the carriage for the long journey back to Blackthorne. Inside the carriage, wrapped in blankets against the cold, Cassian felt the reality of what he'd done beginning to settle into his bones. He'd surrendered power he'd spent years accumulating, exposed his vulnerabilities to enemies who would absolutely exploit them, chosen principle over survival in a world where survival was everything. And he felt more at peace than he'd ever been in his life. Seraphina's head rested on his shoulder, her breathing finally steady. They rode in silence through countryside that looked wounded by winter's retreat. The landscape matched how Cassian felt internally, raw, exposed, uncertain what would grow in the scorched earth left behind. "We'll survive this," Seraphina said quietly. "I know. How? The same way we've survived everything else, together." The word felt revolutionary. Cassian had spent 30 years believing together meant weakness, that depending on anyone created vulnerabilities enemies could exploit. But sitting in a carriage with his wife after deliberately destroying his political standing to prove he'd changed, together felt like the only thing that mattered. They reached Blackthorne after midnight. The castle rose from darkness like a monument to everything Cassian had been and everything he was trying to become. Staff met them at the entrance, their faces carefully neutral. News of the parliamentary disaster had clearly already reached the estate. Cassian dismissed everyone and led Seraphina to their chambers, not separate rooms anymore. One shared space because that's what actual marriage looked like. Inside, with fire burning low in the hearth and rain hammering the windows, Seraphina finally spoke what they'd both been avoiding. "What happens now?" Cassian removed his coat with movements that felt disconnected from intention. "Honestly, I have no idea. I've never deliberately destroyed my own power base before. The strategic playbook doesn't cover it. We'll have less income, less influence, less security. We'll have each other without the foundation being poisoned by who I had to be to maintain power." Seraphina crossed to where he stood and framed his face with her hands. "You terrify me sometimes. The way you can just burn everything down and call it progress. Progress requires destroying what doesn't work anymore. And if we can't rebuild, then at least we'll fail having actually tried instead of rotting inside a gilded prison pretending we were happy." The honesty was brutal and complete. They were gambling everything on the possibility that love built on truth was stronger than power built on fear. The odds weren't good. The consequences of failure were catastrophic. They were doing it anyway. Seraphina kissed him with the desperate intensity of someone who'd watched their husband commit political suicide to prove he'd changed. Cassian responded with equal desperation, his hands tangling in her hair as weeks of tension finally shattered into need. They made love with the violence of two people who'd survived their own destruction and emerged somehow still intact. Afterward, wrapped in sheets that smelled of rain and smoke, Cassian felt something inside him finally settle into place. He'd spent his entire life being powerful. Tonight, he was just a man holding the woman he loved while the empire he'd built collapsed around him. And for the first time in 30 years, Cassian Vale understood what it meant to be free. The morning brought consequences. Letters arrived before breakfast. Political allies severing connections. Business associates withdrawing from negotiations. Former supporters distancing themselves from the Duke, who demonstrated such spectacular incompetence. Cassian read them without emotion. This was the price of choosing differently. He'd known it was coming. Then the final letter arrived, sealed with Eveline's family crest. Cassian broke the seal with steady hands and read words that made his blood run cold. "You think you've won by being noble, by choosing your precious Duchess over power. But you've only delayed the inevitable. I've spent 10 years learning every weakness in Blackthorne's foundation, every vulnerability, every secret. And I'm going to use all of it to ensure you lose everything. Your estate, your marriage, your pathetic attempt at redemption. I'll burn it all down and dance in the ashes. You should have destroyed me when you had the chance. Now it's too late." The signature was Eveline's, but the tone was pure venom. Seraphina read over his shoulder, her face going pale. "She's declaring war." Cassian set the letter down with careful control. "Yes. What are we going to do?" And that was the question that would determine whether his choice in Parliament had been courage or just elaborate suicide. Because Eveline wasn't bluffing, she knew Blackthorne's vulnerabilities better than anyone, and she was angry enough and desperate enough to deploy that knowledge with surgical precision. The empire Cassian had spent 30 years building was already damaged. Evelyn was going to finish destroying it, and he had to decide whether to fight back with the old weapons or trust that the new path he'd chosen was strong enough to survive what was coming. Cassian looked at his wife, at the woman who'd survived her own betrayals and somehow maintained her humanity, at the person who'd shown him that strength came in forms he'd never imagined. Then he did something that would have been impossible months ago. He admitted he didn't know what to do and asked for help. Seraphina's eyes widened slightly. "You're asking my opinion." "I'm asking for your partnership. Because facing Evelyn alone with the old strategies means reverting to everything I've spent months trying to stop being. But I don't know how to fight without becoming the monster." Seraphina took his hand, her grip fierce. "Then we find a third option, something that's neither surrender nor brutality." "Does that exist?" "I don't know. But we'll figure it out together." The word again. Together. It felt like a shield against everything trying to destroy them. They spent the morning strategizing. Two people who'd barely trusted each other months ago now functioning as actual partners. They reviewed Blackthorne's vulnerabilities, identified what Evelyn could realistically attack, began building defenses that didn't require Cassian to sacrifice his humanity. It was slow work, difficult work, the kind of collaboration Cassian had never allowed himself because asking for help felt like admitting weakness. But weakness and strength were concepts he was still learning to redefine. By afternoon, they had the skeleton of a plan. Not perfect, not guaranteed to work, but honest in ways Cassian's strategies had never been before. They were preparing to implement it when Thomas Arden arrived at Blackthorne, his face grim with news that made everything infinitely worse. "Evelyn didn't just write you a threatening letter," Thomas said without preamble. "She's already moving. She's filed legal challenges to Blackthorne's land titles, distributed falsified documents suggesting financial insolvency. And she's apparently been gathering testimony from former staff claiming abuse and misconduct. The attacks were comprehensive and devastating, exactly what someone with years of inside knowledge could orchestrate." Cassian felt the old rage rising in his chest, the fury that had defined him for decades. Every instinct screamed to retaliate with overwhelming force, to crush Evelyn so thoroughly she'd never threaten anyone again. But that was the Duke he'd been, not the person he was trying to become. "How long do we have?" Seraphina asked quietly. Thomas's expression was bleak. "Days. Maybe a week before the legal challenges start gaining traction. The falsified insolvency documents are already circulating among your creditors." Cassian stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. The walls were closing in. Evelyn was attacking from every angle simultaneously, and the weapons that would save him required becoming the person he'd sworn he wouldn't be anymore. The choice was impossible. Remain true to the growth he'd achieved and watch everything burn, or revert to the Duke who destroyed enemies without mercy and proved the transformation was fiction. Seraphina watched him pace, understanding the war happening inside him. She crossed the room and stopped directly in his path, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What do you need?" she asked. Cassian looked at his wife, this woman who'd shown him that vulnerability could be strength, who'd survived her own destruction and emerged capable of building something new. And he realized what he needed wasn't a strategy or a weapon or a path to victory. He needed to remember why he'd chosen to change in the first place. Not because it was easy or safe or guaranteed success, but because being the person his father had made him was a death sentence delivered slowly over decades. He'd rather die fighting to be someone else than survive as the monster he'd always been. "I need," Cassian said quietly, "to trust that choosing differently is enough, even if it costs me everything." Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. "Then we stand together, and whatever happens, at least we'll know we didn't surrender who we are to survive." Thomas looked between them like they'd lost their minds. "You're really not going to fight back." "We're going to fight," Cassian corrected. "Just not the way Evelyn expects." "How then?" "By being exactly what she claims doesn't exist. People who've actually changed. The plan was insane, possibly suicidal, built on principles that the world they inhabited considered weaknesses to exploit. They were doing it anyway, because sometimes the only way to prove you've changed is to make choices that would have been impossible before, even when those choices look like walking into fire." Cassian turned to Thomas with the same commanding intensity he'd always possessed, but carrying something different underneath now. "Gather everyone who still supports Blackthorne. Staff, tenants, local merchants. Everyone whose lives are connected to this estate. We're going to show them exactly who we are and ask them to stand with us. And if they won't, then Evelyn wins and we lose everything. But at least we'll lose it being honest about who we've become. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war fought with entirely different weapons. 3 days later, Blackthorne's great hall was filled with people who'd built their lives around the estate's stability. Tenant farmers, household staff, local business owners whose prosperity depended on Blackthorne's continued influence. They'd come because the Duke had asked them to, but their faces showed fear and uncertainty. Rumors of legal attacks and financial collapse had spread like plague. Cassian stood before them with Seraphina at his side, looking at faces he'd ignored for years while building political power. These were the people who'd actually maintained his empire while he played games in Parliament, and he'd never once asked what they needed. That ended now. "Thank you for coming," Cassian began, his voice carrying through the hall. "I know you've heard rumors about Blackthorne's troubles. I'm here to tell you those rumors are true." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't reassurance, this was confirmation of their worst fears. "I'm being attacked by someone who knows every weakness this estate possesses. Legal challenges, financial sabotage, character assassination, all designed to destroy Blackthorne completely." The crowd's fear intensified, people exchanging worried glances. I could fight back the way I've always fought, with overwhelming force and brutal tactics that would crush my enemy. But doing that means becoming the person I've spent months trying to stop being. And I won't do that, not even to save everything I've built. Confused murmurs spread through the hall. What was he saying? So instead, Cassian continued, "I'm asking for something I've never asked before, your help." The hall went silent. "I'm asking you to stand with me not because I'm powerful or because you fear the consequences of refusing, but because you believe that people can change, that a man who's been ruthless and cruel can learn to be better, that redemption is possible even for someone who's spent 30 years earning hatred." Someone in the back shouted, "Why should we trust you now?" Cassian met the challenger's eyes directly. "You shouldn't. Trust is earned, not demanded. I've spent decades proving I'm not trustworthy. Changing that requires time I don't have and evidence I can't provide." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to gamble on the possibility that I'm telling the truth. To stand with Blackthorne, not because it's safe, but because it's right. And if I betray that trust, then you'll have every justification to walk away." The proposition was absurd. He was asking people to risk their livelihoods on faith that the Duke of Blackthorne had fundamentally changed his nature. But absurdity was apparently all he had left. Seraphina stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I'm his wife. 6 months ago I fled this estate because I couldn't survive the isolation and systematic sabotage. Duke Vale allowed that to happen through negligence and emotional blindness." The crowd listened with rapt attention. This kind of honesty from nobility was unprecedented. "He spent the last 3 months proving he's capable of change," Seraphina continued. "Not through words, but through action. He fired the person sabotaging me, restructured household management to actually include my voice, learned to be vulnerable instead of dominant." She paused, her hand finding Cassian's, and yesterday he surrendered his political power rather than destroy someone to save himself. He chose integrity over victory in a world where that choice is considered weakness. I'm standing beside him because I've watched him become someone worth standing beside. The hall was absolutely silent. Then an old tenant farmer in the back stood slowly. "I've worked Blackthorne land for 40 years, under your father and under you. Your father was a bastard who treated us like livestock. You've been better, not kind, but fair. If you're saying you want to be more than fair, I'll give you the chance to prove it." Another voice joined. "My family's been in service here for 3 generations. Lady Seraphina treated my daughter with more respect in 2 months than Lady Harrow showed in 10 years. If she believes you've changed, that's enough for me." More voices. A merchant whose business depended on Blackthorne's trade routes. A household maid who'd watched Seraphina's isolation firsthand. A blacksmith whose father had worked the estate. One by one, they stood. Not all of them. Some remained seated, unwilling to gamble on promises from a duke with a history of ruthless self-interest. And Cassian didn't blame them. Their skepticism was earned. But enough stood that the hall filled with a sound like hope struggling to be born. Cassian looked at the people who'd chosen to trust him and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent 30 years commanding loyalty through fear and power. These people were offering something entirely different, faith that change was possible. The meeting continued for hours. They discussed legal defenses against Evelyn's attacks, financial strategies to weather the fabricated insolvency crisis, ways to support each other if Blackthorne's influence continued declining. It was democracy in miniature, voices combining to face a threat that would have destroyed them individually. And Cassian, who'd never shared power with anyone, discovered that collaboration could be stronger than dominance. When the meeting finally concluded, Seraphina pulled him aside in the empty hall. "That was extraordinary," she said quietly. "That was terrifying. I have no idea if it will work. Neither do I. But watching you ask for help instead of demanding obedience was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Cassian pulled her against him, his face buried in her hair. "I'm so far outside my experience I can barely breathe." "Good. That means you're actually changing instead of just performing it." They stood like that while twilight bled across the cliffs outside, two people who'd survived their own destruction preparing to face whatever came next. Together. The next morning brought news that made Cassian's fragile hope feel like delusion. Evelyn had escalated. The legal challenges were moving forward with frightening speed. Creditors were calling in debts based on the falsified insolvency documents. And somehow, impossibly, she'd convinced 3 former staff members to testify about abuse that had never occurred. The attacks were comprehensive and coordinated, exactly what someone with years of inside knowledge could orchestrate. Thomas arrived with increasingly dire updates. The land title challenges were gaining traction. Several major creditors were threatening foreclosure. And the testimony from former staff was being circulated through London society, destroying what remained of Cassian's reputation. "We're losing," Thomas said bluntly. "Every front simultaneously." Cassian stood at the window overlooking cliffs where waves hammered stone with relentless violence. The landscape matched the assault, hammering his life. "Then we lose," he said quietly. Thomas stared at him. "You're giving up." "I'm accepting consequences." "There's a difference." "The hell there is." "You're letting that woman destroy everything." Cassian turned to face Seraphina's brother. "What would you have me do, Thomas? Deploy the evidence of her embezzlement, destroy her credibility, fight with the same weapons that made me the person Seraphina fled from? I'd have you survive. At what cost? At any cost. That's what survival means." Cassian shook his head slowly. "No. Survival at any cost is just existence. I've spent 30 years existing. I'd rather actually live for whatever time I have left." The conviction was absolute. Cassian had finally discovered something worth more than power, the ability to look at himself without hatred. But conviction didn't stop creditors from demanding payment, didn't prevent legal challenges from advancing, didn't protect against testimony from people willing to lie for money. Within 3 days, the situation became critical. Blackthorne's accounts were frozen pending investigation of the insolvency claims. The land title challenges were scheduled for judicial review. And the testimony from former staff had created enough scandal that remaining political allies were abandoning ship. Evelyn was systematically destroying everything Cassian had built, and he was letting her, because stopping her meant becoming the monster again, meant proving that his transformation was fiction, a temporary performance he'd abandoned the moment things got difficult. Seraphina watched him weather each new disaster with something between admiration and horror. "You're really not going to fight back?" "I'm fighting by refusing to become what she expects." "That's not fighting, that's martyrdom." "Maybe." Cassian pulled her against him, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "Or maybe it's finally understanding that some things matter more than winning." "Like what?" "Like being someone you can respect when this is over. However it ends." The words were beautiful and possibly insane. They were betting everything on principle, while the world they inhabited rewarded only ruthless pragmatism. But they'd made their choice. Now they'd live with the consequences. 2 days before the judicial review that would likely strip Blackthorne's land titles, Cassian received an unexpected visitor. Lord Ashford arrived at the estate in the evening, rain hammering his carriage. Cassian met him in the library, curiosity overriding decades of enmity. Ashford looked uncomfortable, a rare expression on the political strategist's usually composed face. He accepted whiskey he didn't drink and paced the room like he was gathering courage. "I came to offer information," Ashford said finally. Cassian waited. "Evelyn Harrow approached me 6 months ago, before your marriage. She offered intelligence about Blackthorne in exchange for political alliance. That's not surprising. I accepted. Ashford's jaw tightened. She provided excellent information. Insights into your strategies. Weaknesses I could exploit. I used it all. Why are you telling me this? Because what happened in Parliament changed how I'm thinking about political warfare. Cassian leaned back in his chair, studying his longtime rival. You watched me commit political suicide and it moved you to confession. I watched you choose integrity over survival. Ashford's voice carried something close to anger. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How absolutely unprecedented in our entire political system? It's called having a conscience. It's called being an idiot. Ashford finally drank the whiskey in one swallow. But it's also the first honest thing I've witnessed in 30 years of political maneuvering, and I find I can't participate in destroying it. He pulled documents from his coat and set them on Cassian's desk. These are communications between Eveline and the witnesses she's bribed to testify against you. Proof that their allegations are fabricated. Proof that she's orchestrated this entire campaign through lies and manipulation. Cassian stared at the documents like they were weapons he didn't recognize. Why give this to me? Because watching you refuse to deploy the embezzlement evidence made me realize I've become exactly what's wrong with our entire system. We treat human decency as weakness and ruthlessness as strength, and that paradigm is destroying everything worth preserving. Ashford moved toward the door, then paused. Use those documents or don't, but know that at least one person witnessed your choice and understood what it cost. Then he was gone, leaving Cassian alone with evidence that could save everything. The same choice he'd faced before, the same impossible decision. Seraphina found him an hour later, still staring at the documents. She read them in silence, her face growing pale. This proves Eveline manufactured the entire scandal. Yes, this saves Blackthorne. Probably. Then why do you look like you're attending a funeral? Because using this makes me exactly what I swore I wouldn't be anymore. Even when she's literally trying to destroy you with lies. Especially then. Because if I only choose integrity when it's convenient, I haven't actually changed. I've just found a more sophisticated performance. Seraphina sank into the chair across from him. So what do we do? Cassian looked at his wife. At the woman who'd gambled everything on the possibility that he could be better than his worst instincts. And he realized the answer had been obvious all along. We do what we've been doing. We stand on principle even when it costs us everything. We trust that being honest is enough even when the world rewards dishonesty. And if we lose everything, then we lose it being who we actually are instead of who we pretended to be. It was madness. Beautiful, principled madness that would almost certainly destroy them. They were choosing it anyway. Cassian stood and walked to the fireplace. He held Ashford's documents over the flames, the evidence that could save them mere inches from destruction. Seraphina's voice stopped him. Wait. He turned, the papers still hovering above fire. She crossed to him, her hands covering his. I've been thinking about what you said in Parliament, about choosing integrity over victory. And I think you're right about refusing to use the embezzlement evidence against Eveline personally. But these documents don't attack her character. They simply prove the truth, that the testimony against you is fabricated. That's not destroying an enemy. That's defending yourself with facts. The distinction was subtle but significant. Cassian had refused to weaponize Eveline's embezzlement because doing so meant attacking her character to save himself. But these documents simply proved that her current attacks were lies. Truth versus character assassination. Defense versus offense. The difference mattered. Cassian looked at the documents in his hand, then at Seraphina's face. You think using these is different than deploying the embezzlement evidence? I think defending yourself with truth isn't the same as destroying someone with their past. You're not attacking Eveline. You're proving she's lying right now. The logic was sound. But Cassian wasn't sure whether he was hearing wisdom or rationalization. The line between principle and self-destruction had become almost impossible to navigate. What would using these prove? He asked quietly. That you've changed enough to see the difference between defense and revenge. That integrity doesn't require martyrdom. And if I'm wrong, if using any weapon against her means I haven't actually changed, then we fail having tried to find a middle path instead of choosing between extremes. Cassian studied his wife's face, searching for certainty in eyes that showed only love and fear in equal measure. She was offering him a third option, not capitulation, not brutality, Something between that might allow survival without sacrificing soul. He didn't know if that option actually existed, but he was willing to find out. The judicial review was scheduled for the following morning. Cassian stood before the magistrate with Seraphina beside him, facing legal challenges that would strip Blackthorne's land titles if successful. Eveline sat in the gallery, her expression serene and satisfied. She believed she'd already won. The three witnesses who'd fabricated testimony were prepared to speak. The falsified documents were ready for submission. Eveline's comprehensive assault was reaching its climax. Then Cassian's attorney stood and presented Lord Ashford's evidence. Communications between Eveline and the witnesses. Financial records showing payments for testimony. Documented proof that the entire case was built on manufactured lies. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Eveline's face drained of color. The witnesses looked panicked. The magistrate called for order with increasing frustration. When silence finally returned, the magistrate studied the evidence with methodical precision. Then he looked at Eveline with the kind of cold contempt reserved for those who'd wasted the court's time with deliberate falsehood. The case was dismissed. The land title challenges were thrown out. The witnesses were charged with perjury, and Eveline Harrow was arrested for fraud. Cassian watched it happen with emotions so complex he couldn't begin to process them. Relief, vindication, guilt, triumph, horror, all crashing together in his chest like waves in a storm. He'd won, but victory tasted like ashes mixed with blood. Outside the courthouse, Seraphina pulled him aside while rain began falling again. "You defended yourself. You didn't destroy her." Cassian watched through the window as constables led Eveline away. "She's being arrested. Her life is destroyed. Because she committed crimes. Not because you weaponized her past." The distinction felt thinner than Seraphina claimed. Eveline was ruined either way. Whether that ruin came from exposing her embezzlement or proving her current lies seemed almost irrelevant. But maybe the distinction wasn't about outcomes. Maybe it was about who Cassian was willing to be to achieve those outcomes. He'd defended himself with truth instead of attacking with character assassination. He'd drawn a line between justice and revenge, however faint that line appeared. It would have to be enough. They returned to Blackthorne as spring finally broke winter's grip on the northern cliffs. The estate had survived. Cassian had survived. Their marriage had survived. But nothing would ever be the same. The Duke of Blackthorne had proven he could change, and the world would have to decide what that meant. The carriage ride back to Blackthorne felt longer than the journey to London had been. Rain continued its assault on the countryside, turning roads to rivers of mud that slowed their progress to a crawl. Cassian sat across from Seraphina in silence, watching her face in the dim light filtering through rain-streaked windows. She looked exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness, the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have destroyed you. He understood the feeling intimately. The courtroom victory replayed in his mind with the obsessive quality of trauma. Eveline being led away in chains, the magistrate's cold pronouncement of fraud, the witnesses crumbling under examination. It had been brutal and swift and absolutely deserved. So why did Cassian feel like he'd lost something essential anyway? "You're thinking too much," Seraphina said quietly, her eyes still closed. "How can you tell?" "Because you only get that specific kind of silence when you're tearing yourself apart inside." Cassian managed a slight smile. "I'm wondering if defending myself with truth is actually different from destroying someone with their past, or if I'm just finding sophisticated ways to rationalize the same behavior." Seraphina opened her eyes and studied him with that analytical focus he'd first noticed at the winter gala, where they'd met. "You used evidence of her current crimes, not her past failures." "That's the distinction. Is it enough of a distinction to matter?" "I don't know. But you drew a line and stayed on one side of it. That's more than you would have done 6 months ago." The assessment was accurate, but unsatisfying. Cassian had spent 3 months learning to be vulnerable, to choose integrity over victory, to become someone his wife could respect. Then the moment things became critical, he deployed weapons that looked disturbingly similar to the ones he'd always used. Different in degree, maybe, but not different in kind. Or maybe he was being too hard on himself. Maybe the distinction between defense and revenge actually mattered. Maybe growth didn't mean never fighting back, just fighting back differently. Cassian didn't know. And the not knowing felt like standing on unstable ground where every step might trigger collapse. They reached Blackthorne as twilight bled into full darkness. The estate looked different somehow, less like a fortress, and more like a home that had survived siege. Staff met them at the entrance with expressions ranging from relief to cautious optimism. News of the courtroom victory had clearly preceded them. Thomas was waiting in the entrance hall, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from managing crisis for days without sleep. He pulled Seraphina into an embrace that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, then turned to Cassian with an expression that mixed respect and residual hostility. "You won," Thomas said flatly. "We survived," Cassian corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "You defended Blackthorne, exposed Evelyn's lies, kept your land titles. Sounds like winning to me." Oops. Cassian removed his coat with movements that felt mechanical. "I feel like I compromised everything I've spent months building the moment things got difficult." "You defended yourself with facts. That's not compromise, that's survival." The words echoed what Seraphina had said in the carriage, but repetition didn't make them feel more true. Cassian had drawn a line between using evidence of current crimes versus past failures, but lines drawn under pressure had a way of blurring into rationalizations. He needed to examine that line more carefully, needed to understand whether he'd actually stayed true to his principles or just found a more palatable way to deploy the same ruthless tactics. But first he needed sleep. The following morning arrived with sunlight that felt like an insult after weeks of rain and darkness. Cassian woke to find Seraphina already awake, sitting at the window in her nightgown with her knees drawn up. The pose reminded him of the night he'd found her in the library, convinced their progress was temporary. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Seraphina turned slightly. "I keep thinking about Evelyn, about what happens to her now. She'll be tried for fraud, likely imprisoned. Her reputation is destroyed. Because we defended ourselves. Because she committed crimes and we proved it." Seraphina was silent for a moment. "Do you think she loved you? Actually loved you? Or was it obsession disguised as devotion?" The question cut deeper than Cassian expected. He sat up, running his hands through his hair, while he considered what he actually believed versus what was convenient to believe. "I think she loved an idea of me," he said finally. "The powerful Duke who needed her indispensability. I don't think she ever saw me as an actual person with flaws and limitations. And I encouraged that by being emotionally unavailable for years. So you're claiming responsibility for her actions. I'm claiming responsibility for creating conditions where her delusions could flourish. I'm not responsible for her choices, but I contributed to the environment that made those choices possible." It was the kind of nuanced accountability Cassian had never engaged with before. The old Duke would have blamed Evelyn entirely and moved on. But the person he was trying to become understood that human behavior was more complex than simple cause and effect. People weren't chess pieces. They were damaged creatures making choices from limited options while carrying trauma that distorted everything they perceived. Evelyn had made terrible choices, but Cassian had created the chessboard she was playing on. The distinction mattered. Seraphina crossed to the bed and sat beside him, her hand finding his with the kind of casual intimacy that still felt revolutionary. "What are you going to do?" "About what?" "About Evelyn. About the trial. About whether you testify or let the evidence speak for itself." Cassian hadn't considered that he had a choice. The prosecution would likely call him as a witness. He'd be expected to condemn Evelyn publicly, to detail her crimes with the same cold precision he'd once used to destroy political enemies. The thought made him physically sick. "I don't want to destroy her in court," he said quietly. "I want her held accountable for what she did. But I don't want to be the instrument of her complete annihilation. Those might be the same thing. Or they might not be. I won't know unless I try to find the difference." Over the following weeks, Cassian engaged in the most difficult work of his life, not managing political fallout or rebuilding damaged alliances, but examining his own behavior with the kind of brutal honesty that made sleep nearly impossible. He met regularly with the physician who specialized in trauma, talking through the choices he'd made in Parliament and the courtroom, dissecting his motivations, separating defense from revenge, understanding where principle ended and self-interest began. The work was agonizing, because easy answers didn't exist. Every choice Cassian had made carried mixed motivations. He'd refused to use the embezzlement evidence partly from principle and partly from fear of reverting to who he'd been. He'd used Ashford's documents partly to defend himself and partly because losing everything terrified him. Human behavior, he was learning, was never pure. It was always contaminated by fear and need and the desperate desire to survive while maintaining some shred of dignity. The best he could do was acknowledge the contamination and try to minimize it, which brought him to Evelyn's trial. The prosecution wanted Cassian to testify, to detail the systematic sabotage, to paint Evelyn as a calculating criminal who'd betrayed his trust for personal gain. The testimony would be devastating and guaranteed to result in maximum sentencing. Cassian refused. His attorney looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're the primary victim. Your testimony is critical. Then present the evidence without me. Let the facts speak for themselves. The facts aren't enough. The court needs to understand the human cost of her actions." "The human cost," Cassian said quietly, "is that a woman who served my household for 10 years became so emotionally entangled that she destroyed herself trying to destroy me. Testifying turns that tragedy into spectacle. She tried to ruin you, and she failed. Grinding her into dust now serves no purpose except satisfying my desire for revenge." The attorney left shaking his head, convinced his client had developed some kind of stress-induced mental disorder. Maybe he had, but Cassian was done making decisions based on what other people expected. He'd spent 30 years performing the role of ruthless duke. If being vulnerable and merciful made him look weak, so be it. He'd rather be weak and human than powerful and empty. The trial proceeded without Cassian's testimony. The evidence was presented with clinical precision. Financial records, communications, witness statements. The case was airtight, even without the dramatic testimony the prosecution had wanted. Evelyn was convicted on all counts. Cassian attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom where shadows hid his face. He watched Evelyn stand before the judge, her shoulders rigid with the kind of desperate dignity people cling to when everything else has been stripped away. The judge delivered a sentence of 5 years imprisonment, not the maximum penalty, but substantial enough to serve as warning against similar crimes. Evelyn's face remained impassive as the sentence was read, but her hands trembled, the only visible crack in her composure. As she was being led away, her eyes found Cassian's in the shadows. For several seconds they stared at each other across the crowded courtroom, two people whose lives had become catastrophically entangled in ways neither had intended. Then she was gone, and Cassian was left with the hollow victory of having survived someone else's destruction. He found Seraphina waiting outside the courthouse, leaning against their carriage in afternoon sunlight that made her dark hair look almost blue. She studied his face with concern that immediately shifted to understanding. "You look like someone attending a funeral." "In a way, I am. The person Evelyn was before obsession destroyed her is dead. What's left is just wreckage." Seraphina took his hand, her fingers weaving through his. "You showed her mercy by not testifying. I showed her basic human decency." "That's not the same as mercy. It's more than most people in your position would have done. Most people in my position are monsters. I'm trying not to be." The admission was simple and devastating. Cassian had finally accepted that the baseline he'd been measuring himself against was fundamentally broken. Being better than other ruthless aristocrats wasn't enough. He needed to be better than the entire system that had shaped him, and he had no idea if that was even possible. They rode back to Blackthorne in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned to sit with difficult emotions instead of deflecting them. The landscape had transformed during their weeks in London. Spring had finally conquered winter's grip. Green pushed through dead grass. Trees budded with the tentative optimism of renewal. The world was rebuilding itself. Maybe they could too. That evening, Cassian stood in his study reviewing documents related to Blackthorne's restructured shipping agreements. The new system was less profitable, but more equitable, spreading authority among multiple parties instead of concentrating it in his hands alone. It felt like watching an empire he'd built being dismantled piece by piece. It also felt like the rightest thing he'd ever done. Seraphina entered without knocking, carrying 2 glasses of wine she set on his desk. She'd changed from her travel clothes into something simpler, her hair loose around her shoulders. The informality felt intimate in ways formal dinner attire never had. "You're brooding," she observed. "I'm reflecting. There's a difference. Not much of one. Not—" Cassian accepted the wine glass she offered. "I'm thinking about how much I've lost in the last 6 months. Political influence, concentrated power, the reputation that made people fear crossing me. Everything I spent 30 years building, and I don't miss any of it." The admission surprised him as much as it surprised her. He'd expected to mourn the loss of power, to feel diminished by its absence. Instead, he felt lighter, like he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized was crushing him until it was gone. Power built on fear and dominance was just elaborate prison where the jailer and prisoner were the same person. Seraphina moved to stand beside him at the window. You're different, fundamentally different than the man I married. Better or worse? Different. The rest is subjective. Cassian turned to face her directly. Do you love me? The question emerged without planning, raw and vulnerable in ways he'd never allowed himself to be. Seraphina's eyes widened slightly, surprise crossing features that immediately softened into something he couldn't quite identify. I didn't marry you for love, she said quietly. I married you for survival, for my family's financial security, for the strategic alliance it represented. I know, but watching you choose integrity over power, watching you dismantle your own armor, even when it left you bleeding, that changed something. Cassian felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Changed it into what? Seraphina's hand rose to touch his face, her fingers tracing the harsh lines that decades of emotional control had carved into his features. Into something that might become love if we're brave enough to let it. The words hit him like physical impact, not a declaration, not certainty, just possibility offered with the same analytical honesty that had defined her from the beginning. And somehow that made it more valuable than any passionate confession could have been. I don't know how to be loved, Cassian said quietly. I don't even know if I'm capable of loving someone the way they deserve. Neither do I. But we can figure it out together. There was that word again. Together. It had become their anchor through every storm, the foundation they were building from the wreckage of who they'd been. Cassian pulled her against him, his face buried in her hair, while emotions he'd spent 30 years suppressing finally broke through defenses he'd stopped maintaining. He didn't cry, couldn't quite access that level of vulnerability yet, but he held his wife with the desperate intensity of someone who'd finally found something worth more than power, worth more than survival, worth everything he'd been too afraid to want. They stood like that until darkness filled the windows and the fire burned low in the hearth. Then Seraphina pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face with careful attention. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Cassian felt anxiety spike in his chest. What? I'm pregnant. The words didn't process immediately. Cassian heard them, but couldn't connect them to meaning. Pregnant. A child. His child growing inside the woman he was learning to love. How long? He managed. About 6 weeks. I found out the day before the parliamentary vote. I almost told you then, but everything was falling apart, and I didn't want to complicate things further. Cassian's hand moved to her stomach almost involuntarily, covering the place where life was quietly building itself. 6 weeks. She'd known when he was facing political annihilation, had carried that knowledge through courtroom battles and travel and the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to know we could survive the worst first, before bringing a child into whatever remained. And now. Seraphina's hand covered his. Now I think we might actually build something worth inheriting. The possibility was terrifying and extraordinary in equal measure. A child meant responsibility beyond anything Cassian had ever faced. Meant becoming the kind of father his own father had never been. Meant breaking cycles of trauma that extended back generations. It meant having something precious enough that losing it would destroy him, which was exactly why it mattered. I'm terrified, Cassian admitted. Good. Terror means you understand what's at stake. What if I fail? What if I revert to who I was? What if I damage our child the way my father damaged me? Then we'll handle it together, and we'll do better than our parents did. The confidence in her voice was unearned and absolutely necessary. Neither of them knew if they could actually break the patterns that had shaped them. But they were going to try anyway, because the alternative was resigning themselves to repeating history. Cassian pulled Seraphina back against him, his hand still covering the place where their child grew. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine a future defined by something other than power and control. A future where love mattered more than dominance, where vulnerability was strength instead of weakness, where the Duke of Blackthorne became just a man trying to be better than his worst inheritance. The months that followed were simultaneously ordinary and transformative. Seraphina's pregnancy progressed with medical precision that left Cassian perpetually anxious. He read every book on childbirth and infant care he could acquire, approaching fatherhood with the same obsessive attention he'd once applied to political strategy. Seraphina found his anxiety both endearing and exhausting. You're going to wear a hole in the floor with your pacing, she observed one evening as he circled their chambers for the 100th time. The physician said there could be complications. The physician said complications are possible with any pregnancy. That's not the same as probable. Cassian stopped pacing and sat beside her on the bed, his hand finding her considerably enlarged stomach. Inside, the baby kicked with the violence of someone already protesting confinement. "I can't lose you," he said quietly. Seraphina's hand covered his. "You won't. You don't know that." "No. But I'm choosing to believe it anyway because the alternative is living in constant terror." The logic was sound, but Cassian's terror remained untouched by reason. He'd finally found someone who made life feel worth living beyond the acquisition of power. The possibility of losing her before they'd even finished building what they'd started was unbearable. But bearing the unbearable was apparently what love required. Meanwhile, Blackthorne continued its transformation. The restructured shipping agreements had stabilized, creating more equitable trade relationships that reduced Cassian's personal profit but increased regional prosperity. Tenant farmers reported better harvests due to updated agricultural techniques Seraphina had researched and implemented. The household staff operated with renewed efficiency now that authority structures were clear and respected. The estate was thriving in ways it never had under Cassian's authoritarian control, which forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His iron-fisted dominance had been actively harmful to the very systems he'd been trying to protect. The realization was humbling in ways that went beyond ego. Cassian had spent 30 years convinced that his ruthless leadership was necessary, that without his constant control, everything would collapse into chaos. Instead, distributing power had created stability his dominance never achieved. He was forced to accept that his entire operational philosophy had been wrong. Not just ineffective, fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The admission should have destroyed him. Instead, it felt like liberation. If his old strategies had been wrong, then abandoning them wasn't weakness. It was correction, evolution, growth. He was becoming someone new, not despite losing power, but because of it. The philosophical implications kept him awake nights, turning over questions that had no easy answers. What did strength actually mean? How did you lead without dominating? Where was the line between healthy authority and toxic control? He discussed these questions with Seraphina during long evenings in the library. She approached them with the same analytical precision she brought to everything, dissecting concepts until they revealed their underlying structures. "Strength is doing what's right even when it costs you everything," she said one night while rain hammered the windows. "Weakness is doing what's easy and calling it necessary. By that definition, I've been weak for 30 years. By that definition, most people are weak most of the time. You're just finally admitting it." The honesty was brutal and exactly what Cassian needed. Seraphina never coddled him or softened difficult truths. She treated him like someone capable of handling reality in its full complexity, which made him want to actually be that person. Labor came on a winter night 8 months after the courtroom victory. Seraphina's water broke during dinner, soaking through her dress with the kind of dramatic timing that would have been comedic if Cassian hadn't immediately panicked. "Get the physician," Seraphina said with remarkable calm. Cassian ran. The birth lasted 14 hours, though it felt like 14 years to Cassian, who spent the entire time being systematically excluded from the bedroom where his wife was apparently dying based on the sounds emerging from behind closed doors. No one was actually dying. Childbirth was just violent and terrifying and involved levels of pain that made Cassian question every decision that had led to this moment. Then he heard the baby crying. The sound cut through his panic like light through darkness, sharp and furious, and absolutely alive. Cassian stood frozen in the hallway, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break free from his chest. The bedroom door opened. The physician emerged with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who just wrestled nature and won. "You have a daughter, Your Grace. Both mother and child are healthy." Cassian pushed past him into the bedroom before conscious thought could stop motion. Seraphina lay in bed looking absolutely destroyed, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, and her skin pale as death. But her eyes blazed with fierce triumph as she held a tiny wrapped bundle against her chest. "Meet your daughter," she said quietly. Cassian crossed to the bed on legs that barely supported his weight. He looked down at the small face visible above the blankets, features still red and wrinkled from the violence of birth. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. His daughter opened her eyes and stared at him with the unfocused attention of the newly born. She had Seraphina's dark hair and what would probably become his brutal jawline. She was perfect and terrifying, and absolutely his responsibility. Cassian reached out with trembling hands, and Seraphina transferred the baby to his arms with the careful instruction of someone passing over something infinitely precious and breakable. The weight was almost nothing, but the significance was everything. This was his daughter, his child, a person who would be shaped by his choices and damaged by his failures, and hopefully strengthened by whatever wisdom he managed to accumulate. The responsibility was crushing. "What should we name her?" Seraphina asked quietly. Cassian had considered dozens of names over the past months. Traditional family names, powerful aristocratic designations. Nothing had felt right. But looking at his daughter's face, one name emerged with absolute certainty. "Hope," he said quietly, "because that's what she represents." Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. "Hope Vale. I like it." They sat together in the aftermath of birth, new parents staring at the person they'd created while the weight of responsibility settled onto shoulders that felt inadequate to carry it. But inadequacy, Cassian was learning, was just the starting point. Growth came from acknowledging you didn't know what you were doing and trying anyway, which was exactly what fatherhood would require. The weeks after Hope's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Cassian discovered that all his careful research meant nothing when faced with an actual infant whose needs seemed incomprehensible and whose crying could shred his nerves to ribbons. He was terrible at it. Seraphina was better, but still learning. They stumbled through together, making mistakes and correcting them, and slowly developing competence through sheer repetition. One night, Cassian walked the halls of Blackthorne with Hope, screaming against his shoulder, her tiny body rigid with whatever infant distress he couldn't identify or fix. He'd tried feeding, changing, rocking. Nothing worked. He felt like the worst father in history. Then Hope suddenly quieted, her small hand wrapping around his finger with surprising strength. She stared up at him with eyes that were slowly shifting from newborn blue toward something darker, more aware. And Cassian felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This small person trusted him completely, depended on him for everything, believed with the absolute faith of the helpless that he would keep her safe and fed and loved. The trust was unearned and terrifying and absolutely necessary to honor. "I promise," Cassian whispered to his daughter in the darkness of Blackthorne's halls, "that I will be better than my father, that I will let you be weak without punishing you for it, that I will teach you strength means honesty, not dominance." Hope made a small noise that might have been agreement or just gas. It didn't matter. Cassian had made a promise to the most important person in his life. Now he'd spend the rest of his existence trying to keep it. Spring returned to Blackthorne with the kind of aggressive beauty that made the previous winter feel like distant memory. Flowers erupted across the estate grounds. The cliffs lost their hostile edge, becoming merely dramatic instead of threatening. Hope was 6 months old, developing personality at a rate that left Cassian constantly amazed. She smiled when Seraphina sang to her. She laughed when Cassian made ridiculous faces. She demonstrated a stubborn independence that suggested she'd inherited the worst traits from both parents. Cassian loved her with an intensity that physically hurt. One afternoon, he stood in the library with Hope sleeping against his shoulder while he reviewed proposals for expanded trade relationships. Seraphina worked at the desk nearby, managing correspondence with the efficient focus that made her indispensable to Blackthorne's actual operation. The scene was domestic and ordinary, and everything Cassian had never imagined wanting. "You're staring," Seraphina observed without looking up from her letter. "I'm appreciating. Same thing." "Not quite." Seraphina set down her pen and turned to face him. "What are you appreciating?" Cassian looked at his wife and daughter, at the life they'd built from the wreckage of who they'd been. This, us. The fact that I somehow stumbled into something worth more than everything I spent 30 years accumulating. That's unusually poetic for someone who used to communicate primarily through intimidation. I'm trying to develop new skills. How's that going? Terribly. But I'm committed to the attempt. Seraphina crossed to where he stood and wrapped her arms around him carefully, mindful of the sleeping infant between them. They stood like that in afternoon light streaming through library windows. A family that had survived betrayal and political destruction and the systematic dismantling of everything they'd believed about power, and somehow emerged stronger for it. "I love you," Cassian said quietly. The words still felt foreign in his mouth, carrying weight his voice could barely support. But they were true. Somewhere during the months of learning to be vulnerable, he'd fallen completely in love with the woman who'd shown him that strength came in forms he'd never imagined. Seraphina pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "I love you too. Which is inconvenient given how difficult you make everything. I'm working on that. Work faster." They smiled at each other with the kind of exhausted affection that came from surviving impossible circumstances together. Then Hope woke up and started crying, demanding attention with the tyrannical insistence of the very young. Cassian handed her to Seraphina and went to heat milk, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. A year ago, he would have been in Parliament destroying political enemies. Now he was warming bottles for his infant daughter, while his wife managed a state business. The change was absolute, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. That evening, after Hope was finally asleep and the household had settled into quiet, Cassian and Seraphina sat together on the terrace overlooking the cliffs. Stars scattered across the sky like broken glass catching light. The ocean hammered stone with its eternal rhythm. "What are you thinking about?" Seraphina asked. "Everything. Nothing. The fact that I've spent the last year becoming someone I barely recognize." "Do you miss who you were?" Cassian considered the question seriously. The old Duke had been powerful and feared and absolutely miserable beneath the performance. That person had built empires while being incapable of actual human connection. "No," he said finally, "I don't miss him at all. He was successful and utterly empty. And now I'm significantly less successful and infinitely more whole." The assessment was accurate. Cassian had lost political influence and concentrated power. But he'd gained a wife he actually loved, and a daughter who made every morning feel like purpose. He'd learned that vulnerability was strength, and that dominance without emotional courage was just elaborate cowardice. He'd become human, which was the most revolutionary transformation possible for someone who'd spent 30 years being a carefully constructed machine. "Do you think Evelyn understands what she lost?" Seraphina asked quietly. Cassian thought about his former head of household sitting in prison, her life destroyed by obsession that had consumed everything. "I don't know. I hope eventually she finds some kind of peace. But that's not my responsibility anymore. You're really letting go of the anger I'm trying to. Carrying it serves no purpose except poisoning whatever we're building. The forgiveness wasn't complete." Cassian still felt flashes of rage when he remembered Evelyn's systematic sabotage. But rage was losing its grip on him, becoming background noise instead of driving force. Because holding on to anger meant letting Evelyn continue damaging him long after she'd lost the ability to do so directly. And he was done giving her that power. They sat in comfortable silence while darkness deepened and temperature dropped. Eventually, Seraphina shivered and Cassian wrapped his coat around her shoulders, pulling her against him for warmth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For changing. For trying. For being brave enough to admit when you were wrong." Cassian pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the scent that had become home. "Thank you for giving me reasons to change. For believing I could be better than my worst inheritance." They held each other while the universe spun overhead, two damaged people who'd survived their own destruction and built something new from the ruins. It wasn't perfect. They still fought about boundaries and expectations, still struggled with trauma that surfaced in unexpected ways, still had days where old patterns reasserted themselves and required conscious effort to break. But they were trying, and trying together was apparently stronger than succeeding alone. Years passed with the inevitable momentum of time refusing to pause for human convenience. Hope grew from infant to toddler to a small person with fierce opinions and her father's stubborn determination. Blackthorne prospered under shared management that valued collaboration over dominance. Cassian's political influence never recovered to its previous heights. He remained a respected voice, but no longer a dominant force. The shipping alliances he'd restructured continued functioning more equitably than before. Regional prosperity increased as power became distributed instead of concentrated. Everything he'd feared would collapse without his iron control actually improved. The lesson was humbling. On Hope's 5th birthday, Cassian stood in the Great Hall watching his daughter command a party with the same intensity he'd once deployed destroying political enemies. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a small tyrant who'd somehow avoided inheriting his worst characteristics. She looked like Seraphina, acted like a better version of him, loved with the fearless intensity of someone who'd never been taught that emotions were weakness. She was everything he'd never known to want. Seraphina appeared beside him, sliding her hand into his with the casual intimacy of long marriage. Our daughter is a terror. She's perfect. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Cassian smiled, watching Hope organize other children with the efficiency of a military commander. Where does she get the organizational skills? Definitely from you. I'm much more inclined toward chaos. The lie was blatant. Seraphina ran Blackthorne with precision that made Cassian's previous management look amateur, but he appreciated the attempt at diplomacy. How are you feeling? He asked quietly. Seraphina's hand moved to her stomach where their second child was growing. Enormous, exhausted, terrified we're going to ruin this one the way we've probably damaged Hope. We haven't damaged Hope. Give her time. The therapy bills will be extraordinary. They smiled at each other with the dark humor of parents who understood they were absolutely going to fail in ways they couldn't predict or prevent. But they were trying to fail better than their own parents had, which was all anyone could do. That night, after the party ended and Hope was finally asleep, Cassian stood in his study reviewing documents related to Blackthorne's continued evolution. The estate had become something beyond his original vision. A community instead of an empire. A collaboration instead of a kingdom. It was better than anything he could have built alone. Seraphina entered carrying tea he hadn't requested and wouldn't drink, settling into the chair across from his desk with the comfortable ownership of someone who'd claimed this space as much as he had. You're brooding again, still reflecting. The distinction remains minimal. Cassian set down his pen. I'm thinking about how completely wrong I was about everything. How the power I spent 30 years accumulating was just elaborate prison. How vulnerability I thought would destroy me actually saved my life. And I'm grateful I was wrong, because being right would have meant dying the same miserable bastard my father was. Seraphina sipped her tea, studying him over the rim with eyes that still saw too much. You've changed in ways I didn't think possible. The Duke I married would never admit being wrong about anything. The Duke you married was a coward hiding behind performance. I'm trying to be something else. What? Just a man who loves his wife and daughter and wants to be worthy of them? The simplicity was revolutionary. Cassian had spent his entire life defining himself through power and status and fear. Reducing his identity to husband and father felt like shedding armor that had been crushing him for decades. He was lighter without it, freer, more himself than he'd ever been. I'm proud of you, Seraphina said quietly. The words hit him with unexpected force. Cassian had achieved extraordinary things in his previous life. Built political empires, negotiated impossible agreements, destroyed enemies with surgical precision. But no one had ever said they were proud of him, because pride required seeing the person beneath the performance, and Cassian had spent 30 years ensuring no one saw anything real. Thank you, he managed. Seraphina set down her tea and crossed to where he sat. She settled into his lap with the comfortable familiarity of long intimacy, her head resting against his shoulder. Tell me what you're thinking. Cassian wrapped his arms around his pregnant wife, feeling their child move between them. I'm thinking that power built on fear is just fear wearing expensive clothes. That dominance without emotional courage eventually destroys everything it touches. That I'm extraordinarily lucky you were stubborn enough to demand I become someone better. I didn't demand anything. I just refused to accept less than I deserved. Same thing. Not quite. They sat like that while the fire burned low and darkness pressed against windows. Two people who'd survived betrayal and destruction and the systematic dismantling of everything they'd believed about themselves, and built something infinitely more valuable from the ruins. Eventually, Seraphina spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of question she'd been holding. Do you have regrets? Cassian considered the question carefully. He'd lost political influence and concentrated power. His reputation had transformed from feared to merely respected. The empire he'd built had been distributed among systems he no longer controlled. By every measure that had once defined success, he'd failed catastrophically. None, he said finally. Everything I lost was killing me. Everything I gained saved my life. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Easy things don't teach you anything worth knowing. Seraphina shifted to look at his face directly. I'm glad I married you, even when it's been terrible. I'm glad. The admission was characteristic, honest, analytical. Refusing to romanticize difficulties while acknowledging something valuable had emerged from them. I'm glad you fled Blackthorne that night, Cassian said, because it forced me to confront who I'd become and who I needed to stop being. That's possibly the strangest gratitude I've ever received. I'm working on my communication skills. Work faster." They smiled at each other, the same exchange they'd been having for years. Then Seraphina kissed him with the deep familiarity of long partnership, and Cassian responded with the gratitude of someone who'd stumbled into grace he'd never deserved. When they finally pulled apart, Seraphina spoke again. "What do you want Hope to know about you? When she's old enough to understand." Cassian thought about his daughter sleeping upstairs, about the person she would become, and the stories she would hear about her father. "I want her to know that I was terrible for most of my life, that I built power through fear and dominance and emotional brutality, that I was everything wrong with the system I inhabited. That's quite an admission. I also want her to know that people can change, that being wrong for 30 years doesn't mean you have to be wrong forever, that vulnerability is strength, and love is worth more than any empire. And if she asks whether you have regrets, I'll tell her the truth, that my only regret is not changing sooner." The words settled into silence that felt like blessing. Cassian had spent so many years running from truth that speaking it now felt revolutionary. He was done running, done hiding, done being anything except himself in all his flawed and striving humanity. They sat together until exhaustion finally overcame conversation. Then they went to bed in chambers they shared, wrapped around each other in darkness, while their daughter slept down the hall and their second child grew quietly toward birth. It was ordinary, domestic, everything Cassian had once believed would weaken him, and it was the strongest he'd ever been. Months later, their son was born in the same bedroom where Hope had entered the world. The birth was easier this time, though Cassian's panic remained unchanged. He paced hallways while Seraphina did the actual work of bringing life into being. When he was finally allowed into the bedroom, Seraphina looked exhausted but triumphant, holding a small bundle that would become another person, requiring everything Cassian had to give. "Meet your son," she said. Cassian approached slowly, looking down at features still red from the violence of birth. His son had Seraphina's dark eyes and what would probably become his build. He was perfect and terrifying and absolutely his responsibility. "What should we name him?" Seraphina asked. Cassian had thought about this as obsessively as he'd thought about everything related to fatherhood. Dozens of names had been considered and rejected, but one had emerged with the same certainty that Hope's name had carried. "Thomas," he said quietly, "after your brother who gave us the evidence that saved Blackthorne when he could have let us burn." Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. "He'll love that. Thomas Vale," Cassian repeated, testing how it sounded. A name carrying gratitude instead of aristocratic weight. A reminder that family was built through loyalty, not just blood. His son made a small noise of protest at being discussed, and Cassian took him from Seraphina with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. The weight was almost nothing. The significance was everything. "Welcome to the world," Cassian whispered to his son. "I promise to do better than my father, to let you fail without destroying you for it. To teach you that strength means honesty, not domination. The same promises he'd made to Hope. The same promises he'd spend the rest of his life trying to keep." Years continued their forward momentum, indifferent to human attempts at preservation. Hope and Thomas grew with the relentless energy of children refusing to stay children. Blackthorne evolved into something beyond Cassian's original conception, a community that thrived through collaboration instead of dominance. And Cassian himself continued the painful work of becoming someone he could respect. It was never finished. Growth didn't have endpoints, just constant iteration towards something better. But the direction mattered more than the destination. On his 50th birthday, Cassian stood on the terrace overlooking cliffs where he'd once contemplated the empire he was building. The view hadn't changed. The ocean still hammered stone with eternal indifference. The sky still stretched toward infinity. But everything else was different. Seraphina appeared beside him, older now but still carrying the fierce intelligence that had first caught his attention. Their children played in the garden below, Hope teaching Thomas some elaborate game that apparently required extensive shouting. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I spent 30 years building the wrong things, and the last 20 building what actually matters?" Seraphina leaned against him, her hand finding his with muscle memory. "Any regrets?" "Only that I didn't start sooner." "You weren't ready sooner." "No, but I could have been."